A Retrieved Reformation by O. Henry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A guard came to the prison shoe shop where Jimmy Valentine was assiduously stitching uppers and escorted him to the front office. There the warden handed Jimmy his pardon, which had been signed that morning by the governor. Jimmy took it in a tired sort of way. He had served nearly 10 months of a 4-year sentence. He had expected to stay only about 3 months at the longest. When a man with as many friends on the outside as Jimmy Valentine had is received in the stir, it is hardly worthwhile to cut his hair. "Now, Valentine," said the warden, "you'll go out in the morning. Brace up and make a man of yourself. You're not a bad fellow at heart. Stop cracking safes and live straight." "Me?" said Jimmy in surprise. "Why, I never cracked a safe in my life." "Oh, no," laughed the warden. "Of course not. Let's see now. How was it you happened to get sent up on that Springfield job? Was it because you wouldn't prove an alibi for fear of compromising somebody in extremely high-toned society? Or was it merely a case of a mean old jury that had it in for you? It's always one or the other with you innocent victims." "Me?" said Jimmy, still blankly virtuous. "Why, warden, I never was in Springfield in my life." "Take him back, Cronin," said the warden, "and fix him up without going clothes. Unlock him at 7 in the morning and let him come to the bullpen. Better think over my advice, Valentine." At 7:15 on the next morning, Jimmy stood in the warden's outer office. He had on a suit of the villainously fitting, ready-made clothes, and a pair of the stiff, squeaky shoes that the state furnishes to its discharged compulsory guests. The clerk handed him a railroad ticket and the $5 bill with which the law expected him to rehabilitate himself into good citizenship and prosperity. The warden gave him a cigar and shook hands. Valentine 9762 was chronicled on the books, pardoned by governor, and Mr. James Valentine walked out into the sunshine. Disregarding the song of the birds, the waving green trees, and the smell of the flowers, Jimmy headed straight for a restaurant. There he tasted the first sweet joys of liberty in the shape of a broiled chicken and a bottle of white wine, followed by a cigar a grade better than the one the warden had given him. From there he proceeded leisurely to the depot. He tossed a quarter into the hat of a blind man sitting by the door and boarded his train. 3 hours set him down in a little town near the state line. He went into the cafe of one Mike Dolan and shook hands with Mike, who was alone behind the bar. "Sorry we couldn't make it sooner, Jimmy, be-bye," said Mike, "but we had that protest from Springfield to buck against, and the governor nearly balked. Feeling all right?" "Fine," said Jimmy. "Got my key?" He got his key and went upstairs, unlocking the door of a room at the rear. Everything was just as he had left it. There on the floor was still Ben Price's collar button that had been torn from that eminent detective's shirt band when they had overpowered Jimmy to arrest him. Pulling out from the wall a folding bed, Jimmy slid back a panel in the wall and dragged out a dust-covered suitcase. He opened this and gazed fondly at the finest set of burglar's tools in the East. It was a complete set, made of specially tempered steel, the latest designs in drills, punches, braces, and bits, jimmies, clamps, and augers, with 2 or 3 novelties invented by Jimmy himself, in which he took pride. Over $900 they had cost him to have made at Blank, a place where they make such things for the profession. In half an hour Jimmy went downstairs and through the cafe. He was now dressed in tasteful and well-fitting clothes, and carried his dusted and cleaned suitcase in his hand. "Got anything on?" asked Mike Dolan genially. "Me?" said Jimmy in a puzzled tone. "I don't understand. I'm representing the New York Amalgamated Short Snap Biscuit Cracker and Frazzled Wheat Company." This statement delighted Mike to such an extent that Jimmy had to take a seltzer and milk on the spot. He never touched hard drinks. A week after the release of Valentine 9762, there was a neat job of safe burglary done in Richmond, Indiana, with no clue to the author. A scant $800 was all that was secured. 2 weeks after that, a patented, improved, burglar-proof safe in Logansport was opened like a cheese to the tune of $1,500 currency, securities and silver untouched. That began to interest the rogue catchers. Then an old-fashioned bank safe in Jefferson City became active and threw out of its crater an eruption of banknotes amounting to $5,000. The losses were now high enough to bring the matter up to Ben Price's class of work. By comparing notes, a remarkable similarity in the methods of the burglaries was noticed. Ben Price investigated the scenes of the robberies and was heard to remark, "That's Dandy Jim Valentine's autograph. He's resumed business. Look at that combination knob, jerked out as easy as pulling up a radish in wet weather. He's got the only clamps that can do it. And look how clean those tumblers were punched out. Jimmy never has to drill but one hole. Yes, I guess I want Mr. Valentine. He'll do his bit next time without any short time or clemency foolishness." Ben Price knew Jimmy's habits. He had learned them while working up the Springfield case. Long jumps, quick getaways, no Confederates, and a taste for good society. These ways had helped Mr. Valentine to become noted as a successful dodger of retribution. It was given out that Ben Price had taken up the trail of the elusive cracksman, and other people with burglar-proof safes felt more at ease. One afternoon, Jimmy Valentine and his suitcase climbed out of the mail hack in Elmore, a little town 5 miles off the railroad down in the blackjack country of Arkansas. Jimmy, looking like an athletic young senior just home from college, went down the board sidewalk toward the hotel. A young lady crossed the street, passed him at the corner, and entered a door over which was the sign, "The Elmore Bank." Jimmy Valentine looked into her eyes, forgot what he was, and became another man. She lowered her eyes and colored slightly. Young men of Jimmy's style and looks were scarce in Elmore. Jimmy collared a boy that was loafing on the steps of the bank as if he were one of the stockholders, and began to ask him questions about the town, feeding him dimes at intervals. By and by the young lady came out, looking royally unconscious of the young man with the suitcase, and went her way. "Isn't that young lady Polly Simpson?" asked Jimmy with specious guile. "Nah," said the boy. "She's Annabelle Adams. Her pa owns this bank. What'd you come to Elmore for? Is that a gold watch chain? I'm going to get a bulldog. Got any more dimes?" Jimmy went to the Planters Hotel, registered as Ralph D. Spencer, and engaged a room. He leaned on the desk and declared his platform to the clerk. He said he had come to Elmore to look for a location to go into business. How was the shoe business now in the town? He had thought of the shoe business. Was there an opening? The clerk was impressed by the clothes and manner of Jimmy. He himself was something of a pattern of fashion to the thinly gilded youth of Elmore, but now he perceived his shortcomings. While trying to figure out Jimmy's manner of tying his four-in-hand, he cordially gave information. Yes, there ought to be a good opening in the shoe line. There wasn't an exclusive shoe store in the place. The dry goods and general stores handled them. Business in all lines was fairly good. Hoped Mr. Spencer would decide to locate in Elmore. He would find it a pleasant town to live in, and the people very sociable. Mr. Spencer thought he would stop over in the town a few days and look over the situation. No, the clerk needn't call the boy. He would hurry up his suitcase himself. It was rather heavy. Mr. Ralph Spencer, the phoenix that arose from Jimmy Valentine's ashes left by the flame of a sudden and alterative attack of love, remained in Elmore and prospered. He opened a shoe store and secured a good run of trade. Socially, he was also a success and made many friends, and he accomplished the wish of his heart. He met Miss Annabelle Adams and became more and more captivated by her charms. At the end of a year, the situation of Mr. Ralph Spencer was this. He had won the respect of the community, his shoe store was flourishing, and he and Annabelle were engaged to be married in 2 weeks. Mr. Adams, the typical plodding country banker, approved of Spencer. Annabelle's pride in him almost equaled her affection. He was as much at home in the family of Mr. Adams and that of Annabel's married sister as if he were already a member. One day Jimmy sat down in his room and wrote this letter, which he mailed to the safe address of one of his old friends in St. Louis. Dear old pal, I want you to be at Sullivan's place in Little Rock next Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. I want you to wind up some little matters for me, and also I want to make you a present of my kit of tools. I know you'll be glad to get them. You couldn't duplicate the lot for $1,000. Say, Billy, I've quit the old business a year ago. I've got a nice store. I'm making an honest living, and I'm going to marry the finest girl on earth 2 weeks from now. It's the only life, Billy, the straight one. I wouldn't touch a dollar of another man's money now for $1 million. After I get married, I'm going to sell out and go west, where there won't be so much danger of having old scores brought up against me. I tell you, Billy, she's an angel. She believes in me, and I wouldn't do another crooked thing for the whole world. Be sure to be at Sully's, for I must see you. I'll bring along the tools with me. Your old friend, Jimmy. On the Monday night after Jimmy wrote this letter, Ben Price jogged unobtrusively into Elmore in a livery buggy. He lounged about town in his quiet way until he found out what he wanted to know. From the drugstore across the street from Spencer's shoe store, he got a good look at Ralph D. Spencer. "Going to marry the banker's daughter, are you, Jimmy?" said Ben to himself softly. "Well, I don't know." The next morning, Jimmy took breakfast at the Adamses. He was going to Little Rock that day to order his wedding suit and buy something nice for Annabel. That would be the first time he had left town since he came to Elmore. It had been more than a year now since those last professional jobs, and he thought he could safely venture out. After breakfast, quite a family party went downtown together. Mr. Adams, Annabel, Jimmy, and Annabel's married sister with her 2 little girls, aged 5 and 9. They came by the hotel where Jimmy still boarded, and he ran up to his room and brought along his suitcase. Then they went on to the bank. There stood Jimmy's horse and buggy, and Dolph Gibson, who was going to drive him over to the railroad station. All went inside the high carved oak railings into the banking room, Jimmy included, for Mr. Adams' future son-in-law was welcome anywhere. The clerks were pleased to be greeted by the good-looking, agreeable young man who was going to marry Miss Annabel. Jimmy set his suitcase down. Annabel, whose heart was bubbling with happiness and lively youth, put on Jimmy's hat and picked up the suitcase. "Wouldn't I make a nice drummer?" said Annabel. "My, Ralph, how heavy it is! Feels like it was full of gold bricks." "A lot of nickel-plated shoehorns in there," said Jimmy coolly, "that I'm going to return. Thought I'd save express charges by taking them up. I'm getting awfully economical." The Elmore Bank had just put in a new safe and vault. Mr. Adams was very proud of it and insisted on an inspection by everyone. The vault was a small one, but it had a new patented door. It fastened with 3 solid steel bolts thrown simultaneously with a single handle, and had a time lock. Mr. Adams beamingly explained its workings to Mr. Spencer, who showed a courteous but not too intelligent interest. The 2 children, May and Agatha, were delighted by the shining metal and funny clock and knobs. While they were thus engaged, Ben Price sauntered in and leaned on his elbow, looking casually inside between the railings. He told the teller that he didn't want anything. He was just waiting for a man he knew. Suddenly there was a scream or two from the women and a commotion. Unperceived by the elders, May, the 9-year-old girl, in a spirit of play, had shut Agatha in the vault. She had then shot the bolts and turned the knob of the combination as she had seen Mr. Adams do. The old banker sprang to the handle and tugged at it for a moment. "The door can't be opened," he groaned. "The clock hasn't been wound, nor the combination set." Agatha's mother screamed again, hysterically. "Hush!" said Mr. Adams, raising his trembling hand. "All be quiet for a moment. Agatha," he called as loudly as he could, "listen to me." During the following silence they could just hear the faint sound of the child wildly shrieking in the dark vault in a panic of terror. "My precious darling," wailed the mother. "She will die of fright. Open the door. Oh, break it open. Can't you men do something?" "There isn't a man nearer than Little Rock who can open that door," said Mr. Adams in a shaky voice. "My God! Spencer, what shall we do? That child! She can't stand it long in there. There isn't enough air, and besides, she'll go into convulsions from fright." Agatha's mother, frantic now, beat the door of the vault with her hands. Somebody wildly suggested dynamite. Annabel turned to Jimmy, her large eyes full of anguish, but not yet despairing. To a woman, nothing seems quite impossible to the powers of the man she worships. "Can't you do something, Ralph? Try, won't you?" He looked at her with a queer, soft smile on his lips and in his keen eyes. "Annabel," he said, "give me that rose you are wearing, will you?" Hardly believing that she heard him aright, she unpinned the bud from the bosom of her dress and placed it in his hand. Jimmy stuffed it into his vest pocket, threw off his coat, and pulled up his shirt-sleeves. With that act, Ralph D. Spencer passed away, and Jimmy Valentine took his place. "Get away from the door, all of you," he commanded shortly. He set his suitcase on the table and opened it out flat. From that time on, he seemed to be unconscious of the presence of anyone else. He laid out the shining, queer implements swiftly and orderly, whistling softly to himself as he always did when at work. In a deep silence and immovable, the others watched him as if under a spell. In a minute, Jimmy's pet drill was biting smoothly into the steel door. In 10 minutes, breaking his own burglarious record, he threw back the bolts and opened the door. Agatha, almost collapsed but safe, was gathered into her mother's arms. Jimmy Valentine put on his coat and walked outside the railings toward the front door. As he went, he thought he heard a faraway voice that he once knew call, "Ralph!" But he never hesitated. At the door, a big man stood somewhat in his way. "Hello, Ben," said Jimmy, still with his strange smile. "Got around at last, have you? Well, let's go. I don't know that it makes much difference, now." And then Ben Price acted rather strangely. "Guess you're mistaken, Mr. Spencer," he said. "Don't believe I recognize you. Your buggy's waiting for you, ain't it?" And Ben Price turned and strolled down the street. End of A Retrieved Reformation by O. Henry. Read by Winston Tharp.
Aunt Nell by George A. Birmingham. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Mrs. McDermott splashed her way across the yard towards the stable. It was raining softly and persistently. The mud lay deep. There were pools of water here and there. Mrs. McDermott neither paused nor picked her steps. There was no reason why she should. The rain could not damage the tweed cap on her head. Her complexion, brilliant as the complexions of Irish women often are, was not of the kind that washes off. Her rough gray skirt, on which raindrops glistened, came down no further than her knees. On her feet were a pair of rubber boots, which reached up to the hem of her skirt, perhaps further. She was comfortably indifferent to rain and mud. If you reckon the years since she was born, Mrs. McDermott was nearly 40. But that is no true way of estimating the age of man or woman. Seen not in the dusk with the light behind her, but in broad daylight on horseback, she was little more than 30. Such is the reward of living an outdoor life in the damp climate of Connaught, and her heart was as young as her face and figure. She had known no serious troubles and very few of the minor cares of life. Her husband, a man 25 years older than she was, died after 2 years of married life, leaving her a very comfortable fortune. Nell McDermott, the whole country called her Nell, hunted 3 days a week every winter. "Why shouldn't she be young?" young Gafferty, the groom, used to say. Hasn't she 5 good horses, and the full of her skin of meat and drink? The likes of her never get old." Johnny Gafferty was rubbing down a tall bay mare when Mrs. MacDermott opened the stable door and entered the loose box. "Johnny," she said, "you'll put the cob in the governor's cart this afternoon and have him round at 3 o'clock. I'm going to the station to meet my nephew. I've had a letter from his father to say he'll be here to day." Johnny Gafferty, though he had been 8 years in Mrs. MacDermott's service, had never before heard of her nephew. "It could be," he said cautiously, "that the captain will be bringing a horse with him, or maybe 2." He felt that a title of some sort was due to the nephew of a lady like Mrs. MacDermott. The assumption that he would have a horse or 2 with him was natural. All Mrs. MacDermott's friends hunted. "He's not a captain," said Mrs. MacDermott, "and he's bringing no horses, and he doesn't hunt. What's more, Johnny, he doesn't even ride. Couldn't sit on the back of a donkey. So his father says, anyway." "Glory be to God!" said Johnny. "And what sort of a gentleman will he be at all?" "He's a poet," said Mrs. MacDermott. Johnny felt that he had perhaps gone beyond the limits of respectful criticism in expressing his first astonishment at the amazing news that Mrs. MacDermott's nephew could not ride. "Well," he said, "there's worse things than poetry in the world." "Very few sillier things," said Mrs. MacDermott. "But that's not the worst there is about him, Johnny. His health is completely broken down. That's why he's coming here. Nerve strain, they call it." "That's what they would call it," said Johnny sympathetically, "when it's a high up gentleman like a nephew of your own. And it's hard to blame him. There's many a man does be a bit foolish without meaning any great harm by it." To be a bit foolish is a kindly West of Ireland phrase which means to drink heavily. "It is not that," said Mrs. MacDermott. "I don't believe, from what I've heard of him, that the man has even that much in him. It's just what his father says, poetry and nerves. And he's coming here for the good of his health. It's Mr. Bertram they call him, Mr. Bertram Connell." Mrs. MacDermott walked up and down the platform, waiting for the arrival of her nephew's train. She was dressed in a very becoming pale blue tweed, and had wrapped a silk muffler of a rather brighter blue round her neck. Her brown shoes, though strong, were very well made and neat. Between them and her skirt was a considerable stretch of knitted stocking, blue like the tweed. Her ankles were singularly well formed and comely. The afternoon had turned out to be fine, and she had taken some trouble about her dress before setting out to meet a strange nephew, whom she had not seen since he was 5 years old. She might have taken more trouble still if the nephew had been anything more exciting than a nerve-shattered poet. The train steamed in at last. Only one passenger got out of a first-class carriage. Mrs. MacDermott looked at him in doubt. He was not in the least the sort of man she expected to see. Poets, so she understood, have long hair and sallow, clean-shaven faces. This young man's head was closely cropped, and he had a fair moustache. He was smartly dressed in well-fitting clothes. Poets are, or ought to be, sloppy in their attire. Also, judged by the color of his cheeks and his vigorous step, this man was in perfect health. Mrs. MacDermott approached him with some hesitation. The young man was standing in the middle of the platform, looking around. His eyes rested on Mrs. MacDermott for a moment, but passed from her again. He was expecting some one whom he did not see. "Are you Bertram Connell, by any chance?" asked Mrs. MacDermott. "That's me," said the young man, "and I'm expecting an aunt to meet me. I say, are you a cousin? I didn't know I had a cousin." The mistake was an excusable one. Mrs. MacDermott looked very young and pretty in her blue tweed. She appreciated the compliment paid her all the more because it was obviously sincere. "You haven't any cousins," she said.
Not on your father's side, anyway. I'm your aunt." "Aunt Nell?" he said, plainly startled by the information. "Great Scott! And I thought—" He paused and looked at Mrs. MacDermott with genuine surprise. Then he recovered his self-possession. He put his arm round her neck and kissed her heartily, first on one cheek, then on the other. Aunts are kissed by their nephews every day as a matter of course. They expect it. Mrs. MacDermott had not thought about the matter beforehand. If she had, she would have taken it for granted that Bertram would kiss her, occasionally, uncomfortably, and without conviction. The kisses she actually received embarrassed her. She even blushed a little, and was annoyed with herself for blushing. "There doesn't seem to be much the matter with your nerve," she said. Bertram became suddenly grave. "My nerves are in a rotten state," he said. "The doctor, specialist, you know, tip-top man, said the only thing for me was life in the country, fresh air, birds, flowers, new milk, all that sort of thing." "Your father wrote all that to me," said Mrs. MacDermott. "Poor old dad," said Bertram. "He's horribly upset about it." Mrs. MacDermott was further puzzled about her nephew's nervous breakdown when she suggested about 7 o'clock that it was time to dress for dinner. Bertram, who had been talking cheerfully and smoking a good deal, put his arm around her waist and ran her upstairs. "Jolly thing to have an aunt like you," he said. Mrs. MacDermott was slightly out of breath and angry with herself for blushing again. At bedtime she refused a good night kiss with some dignity. Bertram protested. "Oh, I say, Aunt Nell, that's all rot, you know. An aunt is just one of the people you do kiss, night and morning." "No, you don't," she said. "And anyway, you won't get the chance to morrow morning. I shall be off early. It's a hunting day." "Can't I get a horse somewhere?" said Bertram. Mrs. MacDermott looked at him in astonishment. "Your father told me," she said, "that you couldn't ride and had never been on a horse in your life." "Did he say that? The poor dad! I suppose he was afraid I'd break my neck." "If you're suffering from nervous breakdown—" "I am, frightfully. That's why they sent me here." "Then you shouldn't hunt," said Mrs. MacDermott. "You should sit quietly in the library and write poetry. That reminds me, the rector is coming to dinner to night. I thought you'd like to meet him." "Why? Is he a sporting old bird?" "Not in the least. But he's the only man about this country who knows anything about poetry. That's why I asked him." Johnny Gafferty made a report to Mrs. MacDermott when she returned from hunting which surprised her a good deal. "The young gentleman, ma'am," he said, "was round in the stable this morning shortly after you leaving, and nothing would do him only for me to saddle the bay for him." "Did you do it?" "What else could I do," said Gafferty, "when his heart was set on it?" "I suppose he's broken his own neck and the mare's knees," said Mrs. MacDermott. "He has not, then. Neither the one nor the other. I don't know how he'd do if you faced him with a stone wall, but the way he took the bay over the fence at the end of the paddock was as neat as ever I seen. You couldn't have done it better yourself, ma'am." "He can ride, then?" "Ride!" said Gafferty. "Is it ride? If his poetry's no worse nor his riding, he'll make money by it yet." The dinner with the rector was not an entire success. The clergyman, warned beforehand that he was to entertain a well-known poet, had prepared himself by reading several books of Wordsworth's excursion. Bertram shied at the name of Wordsworth, and insisted on hearing from his aunt a detailed account of the day's run. This puzzled Mrs. MacDermott a little, but she hit upon an explanation which satisfied her. The rector was enthusiastic in his admiration of Wordsworth. Bertram, a poet himself, evidently suffered from professional jealousy. Mrs. MacDermott, who had looked forward to her nephew's visit with dread, began to enjoy it. Bertram was a cheerful young man, with an easy flow of slangy conversation. His tastes were very much the same as Mrs. MacDermott's own. He smoked and drank whiskey and soda in moderate quantities. He behaved in all respects like a normal man, showing no signs of the nervousness which goes with the artistic temperament. His politeness to her and the trouble he took about her comfort in small matters were very pleasant. He had large, handsome blue eyes, and Mrs. MacDermott liked the way he looked at her. His gaze expressed a frank admiration which was curiously agreeable. A week after his arrival, Mrs. MacDermott paid a high compliment to her nephew. She promised to mount him on the bay mare and take him out hunting. She had satisfied herself that Johnny Gafferty was not mistaken and that the young man really could ride. Bertram, excited and in high good humor, succeeded, before she had time to protest, in giving her a hearty kiss of gratitude. The morning of the hunt was warm and moist. The meet was in one of the most favorable places in the country. Mrs. MacDermott, drawing on her gloves in the hall before starting, noted with gratification that her nephew's breeches were well cut and his stock neatly fastened. Johnny Gafferty could be heard outside the door speaking to the horses which he held ready. A telegraph boy arrived on a bicycle. He handed the usual orange envelope to Mrs. MacDermott. She tore it open impatiently and glanced at the message inside. She gave an exclamation of surprise and read the message through slowly and carefully. Then, without a word, she handed it to her nephew. "Very sorry," the telegram ran. "Only to day discovered that Bertram had not gone to you as arranged. He is in a condition of complete prostration. Cannot start now. Connell." "It's from my brother," said Mrs. MacDermott. "But what on earth does it mean? You're here all right, aren't you?" "Yes," he said, "I'm here." He laid a good deal of emphasis on the "I." Mrs. MacDermott looked at him with sudden suspicion. "I've had a top hole time," he said. "What an utterly incompetent rotter Connell is! He had nothing on earth to do but lie low. His father couldn't have found out." Mrs. MacDermott walked over to the door and addressed Gafferty. "Johnny," she said, "the horses won't be wanted to day." She turned to the young man who stood beside her. "Now," she said, "come into the library and explain what all this means." "Oh, I say, Aunt Nell," he said, "don't let's miss the day. I'll explain the whole thing to you in the evening after dinner." "You'll explain it now if you can." She led the way into the library. "It's quite simple, really," he said. "Bertram Connell, your nephew, though a poet and all that, is rather an ass." "Are you Bertram Connell or are you not?" said Mrs. MacDermott. "Oh, Lord, no! I'm not that sort of fellow at all. I couldn't write a line of poetry to save my life. You simply can't imagine how frightfully brainy he is. All the same, I rather like him. He was my fag at school, and we were up together at Cambridge. I've more or less kept up with him ever since. He's more like a girl than a man, you know. I dare say that's why I liked him. Then he crocked up, nerves and that sort of thing, and they said he must come over here. He didn't like the notion a bit. I was in London just then on leave, and he told me how he hated the idea." "So did I," said Mrs. MacDermott. "I said that he was a silly ass, and that if I had the chance of a month in the west of Ireland in a sporting sort of a house he told me you hunted a lot I'd simply jump at it. But the poor fellow was frightfully sick at the prospect. Said he was sure he wouldn't get on with you, and that you'd simply hate him. He had a book of poetry just coming out, and he was hoping to get a play of his taken on, a play about fairies. I give you my word he was very near crying. So after a lot of talking, we hit on the idea of my coming here. He was to lie low in London so that his father wouldn't find him." "You neither of you thought about me, apparently," said Mrs. MacDermott. "Oh, yes, we did. We thought as you hadn't seen him since he was a child that you wouldn't know him. And of course we thought you'd be frightfully old. There didn't seem to be much harm in it." "And you came here and called me Aunt Nell?" "You're far the nicest aunt I've ever seen or even imagined." "And you actually had the cheek to—" Mrs. MacDermott stopped abruptly and blushed. She was thinking of the kisses. His thoughts followed hers, though she did not complete the sentence. "Only the first day," he said. "You wouldn't let me afterwards, except once, and you didn't really let me then. I just did it. I give you my word I couldn't help it. You looked so jolly. No fellow could have helped it. I believe Bertram would have done the same, though he is a poet." "And now," said Mrs. MacDermott, "before you go—" "Must I go?" "Out of this house and back to London to day," said Mrs. MacDermott. "But before you go, I'd rather like to know who you are, since you're not Bertram Connell." "My name is Maitland, Robert Maitland, but they generally call me Bob. I'm in the 30th Lancers. I say, it was rather funny your thinking I couldn't ride, and turning on that old parson to talk poetry to me." Mrs. MacDermott allowed herself to smile. The matter was really settled that day, before Bob Maitland left for London. But it was a week later when Mrs. MacDermott announced her decision to her brother. "There's no fool like an old fool," she wrote, "and at my age I ought to have more sense. But I took to Bob the moment I saw him, and if he makes as good a husband as he did a nephew, we'll get on together all right, though he's a few years younger than I am." End of the story Aunt Nell by George A. Birmingham. Read by Lars Rolander.
The Cat and Cupid by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Cat and Cupid by Arnold Bennett. Part 1. The secret history of the Ebag marriage is now printed for the first time. The Ebag family, who prefer their name to be accented on the first syllable, once almost ruled Oldcastle, which is a clean and conceited borough, with long historical traditions, on the very edge of the industrial, democratic, and unclean Five Towns. The Ebag family still lives in the grateful memory of Oldcastle, for no family ever did more to preserve the celebrated old Castilian superiority in social, moral, and religious matters over the vulgar Five Towns. The episodes leading to the Ebag marriage could only have happened in Oldcastle, by which I mean merely that they could not have happened in any of the Five Towns. In the Five Towns that sort of thing does not occur. I don't know why, but it doesn't. The people are too deeply interested in football, starting prices, rates, public parks, sliding scales, excursions to Blackpool, and municipal shindies to concern themselves with organists as such. In the Five Towns an organist may be a sanitary inspector or an auctioneer on Mondays. In Oldcastle an organist is an organist, recognized as such in the streets. No one ever heard of an organist in the Five Towns being taken up and petted by a couple of old ladies, but this may occur at Oldcastle. It, in fact, did. The scandalous circumstances which led to the disappearance from the Oldcastle scene of Mr. Scarrett, the original organist of St. Placid, have no relation to the present narrative, which opens when the ladies Ebag began to seek for a new organist. The new church of St. Placid owed its magnificent existence to the Ebag family. The apse had been given entirely by old Caiaphas Ebag, ex MP, now a paralytic sufferer, at a cost of £12,000, and his was the original idea of building the church. When, owing to the decline of the working man's interest in beer, and one or two other things, Caiaphas lost nearly the whole of his fortune, which had been gained by honest labor in mighty speculations, he rather regretted the church. He would have preferred 12,000 in cash to a view of the apse from his bedroom window. But he was man enough never to complain. He lived, after his misfortunes, in a comparatively small house with his two daughters, Mrs Ebag and Miss Ebag. These two ladies are the heroines of the tale. Mrs Ebag had married her cousin, who had died. She possessed about 600 a year of her own. She was 2 years older than her sister, Miss Ebag, a spinster. Miss Ebag was 2 years younger than Mrs Ebag. No further information as to their respective ages ever leaked out. Miss Ebag had a little money of her own from her deceased mother, and Caiaphas had the wreck of his riches. The total income of the household was not far short of 1,000 a year. But of this quite 200 a year was absorbed by young Edith Ebag, Mrs Ebag's stepdaughter, for Mrs Ebag had been her husband's second choice. Edith, who was notorious as a silly chit, and spent most of her time in London and other absurd places, formed no part of the household, though she visited it occasionally. The household consisted of old Caiaphas, bedridden, and his two daughters, and Goldie. Goldie was the tomcat, so termed by reason of his splendid tawniness. Goldie had more to do with the Ebag marriage than anyone or anything, except the weathercock on the top of the house. This may sound queer, but is as naught to the queerness about to be unfolded. Part II. It cannot be considered unnatural that Mrs. and Miss Ebag, with the assistance of the vicar, should have managed the affairs of the church. People nicknamed them the churchwardens, which was not quite nice, having regard to the fact that their sole aim was the truest welfare of the church. They and the vicar, in a friendly and effusive way, hated each other. Sometimes they got the better of the vicar, and, less often, he got the better of them. In the choice of a new organist they won. Their candidate was Mr. Carl Ullman, the artistic orphan. Mr. Carl Ullman is the hero of the tale, the son of one of those German designers of earthenware who, at intervals, come and settle in the Five Towns for the purpose of explaining fully to the inhabitants how inferior England is to Germany. He had an English mother, and he himself was violently English. He spoke English like an Englishman, and German like an Englishman. He could paint, model in clay, and play 3 musical instruments, including the organ. His one failing was that he could never earn enough to live on. It seemed as if he was always being drawn by an invisible string towards the workhouse door. Now and then he made half a sovereign extra by deputizing on the organ. In such manner had he been introduced to the Ebag ladies. His romantic and gloomy appearance had attracted them, with the result that they had asked him to lunch after the service, and he had remained with them till the evening service. During the visit they had learnt that his grandfather had been court councillor in the kingdom of Saxony. Afterwards they often said to each other how ideal it would be if only Mr. Skerritt might be removed and Carl Ullman take his place. And when Mr. Skerritt actually was removed by his own wickedness, they regarded it as almost an answer to prayer, and successfully employed their powerful interest on behalf of Carl. The salary was 100 a year. Not once in his life had Carl earned £100 in a single year. For him the situation meant opulence. He accepted it, but calmly, gloomily. romantic gloom was his joy in life. He said with deep melancholy that he was sure he could not find a convenient lodging in Oldcastle. And the ladies Ebag then said that he must really come and spend a few days with them and Goldie and Papa until he was suited. He said that he hated to plant himself on people and yielded to the request. The ladies Ebag fussed around his dark-eyed and tranquil pessimism, and both of them instantly grew younger, a curious but authentic phenomenon. They adored his playing, and they were enchanted to discover that his notion about hymn tunes agreed with theirs, and by consequence disagreed with the vicar's. In the first week or two they scored off the vicar 5 times, and the advantage of having your organist in your own house grew very apparent. They were also greatly impressed by his gentleness with Goldie, and by his intelligent interest in serious questions. One day Miss Ebag said timidly to her sister, "It's just 6 months to day." "What do you mean, sister?" asked Mrs Ebag, self-consciously. "Since Mr Ullman came." "So it is," said Mrs Ebag, who was just as well aware of the date as the spinster was aware of it. They said no more. The position was the least bit delicate. Carl had found no lodging. He did not offer to go. They did not want him to go. He did not offer to pay. And really he cost them nothing except laundry, whiskey, and fussing. How could they suggest that he should pay? He lived amidst them like a beautiful mystery, and all were seemingly content. Carl was probably saving the whole of his salary, for he never bought clothes and he did not smoke. The ladies Ebag simply did what they liked about hymn tunes. III. You would have thought that no outsider would find a word to say, and you would have been mistaken. The fact that Mrs Ebag was 2 years older than Miss, and Miss 2 years younger than Mrs Ebag, the fact that old Caiaphas was, for strong reasons, always in the house, the fact that the ladies were notorious cat idolaters, the fact that the reputation of the Ebag family was, and had ever been, spotless, the fact that the Ebag family had given the apse and practically created the entire church, all these facts, added together, did not prevent the outsider from finding a word to say. At first words were not said, but looks were looked, and coughs were coughed. Then someone, strolling into the church of a morning while Carl Ullman was practising, saw Miss Ebag sitting in silent ecstasy in a corner. And a few mornings later the same someone, whose curiosity had been excited, veritably saw Mrs Ebag in the organ loft with Carl Ullman, but no sign of Miss Ebag. It was at this juncture that words began to be said. Words! Not complete sentences. The sentences were never finished. "Of course it's no affair of mine, but I wonder that people like the Ebags should. Not that I should ever dream of hinting that. First one and then the other. Well! I'm sure that if either Mrs. or Miss Ebag had the slightest idea, they'd at once," and so on, intangible gossamer criticism floating in the air. IV. One evening, it was precisely the 1st of June, when a thunderstorm was blowing up from the southwest and scattering the smoke of the 5 towns to the 4 corners of the world, and making the weathercock of the house of the Ebags creak, the ladies Ebag and Carl Ullman sat together as usual in the drawing room. The French window was open, but banged to at intervals. Carl Ullman had played the piano and the ladies Ebag, Mrs Ebag, somewhat comfortably stout, and Miss Ebag, spare, were talking very well and sensibly about the influence of music on character. They invariably chose such subjects for conversation. Carl was chiefly silent, but now and then, after a sip of whiskey, he would say "Yes" with impressiveness and stare gloomily out of the darkening window. The ladies Ebag had a remarkable example of the influence of music on character in the person of Edith Ebag. It appeared that Edith would never play anything but waltzes, Waldteufel's for choice, and that the foolish frivolity of her flyaway character was a direct consequence of this habit. Carl felt sadly glad, after hearing the description of Edith's carryings on, that Edith had chosen to live far away. And then the conversation languished and died with the daylight, and a certain self-consciousness obscured the social atmosphere. For a vague rumor of the chatter of the town had penetrated the house, and the ladies Ebag, though they scorned chatter, were affected by it. Carl Ullman, too. It had the customary effect of such chatter. It fixed the thoughts of those chatted about on matters which perhaps would not otherwise have occupied their attention. The ladies Ebag said to themselves, "We are no longer aged 19. We are moreover living with our father. If he is bedridden, what then? This gossip connecting our names with that of Mr Ullman is worse than baseless, it is preposterous. We assert positively that we have no designs of any kind on Mr Ullman." Nevertheless, by dint of thinking about that gossip, the naked idea of a marriage with Mr Ullman soon ceased to shock them. They could gaze at it without going into hysterics. As for Carl, he often meditated upon his own age, which might have been anything between 30 and 45, and upon the mysterious ages of the ladies, and upon their goodness, their charm, their seriousness, their intelligence, and their sympathy with himself. Hence the self-consciousness in the gloaming. To create a diversion, Miss Ebag walked primly to the window and cried, "Goldie! Goldie!" It was Goldie's bedtime. In summer he always strolled into the garden after dinner, and he nearly always sensibly responded to the call when his bed hour sounded. No one would have dreamed of retiring until Goldie was safely ensconced in his large basket under the stairs. "Naughty Goldie!" Miss Ebag said, comprehensively, to the garden. She went into the garden to search, and Mrs Ebag followed her, and Carl Ullman followed Mrs Ebag, and they searched without result, until it was black night and the threatening storm at last fell. The vision of Goldie out in that storm desolated the ladies, and Carl Ullman displayed the nicest feeling. At length the rain drove them in, and they stood in the drawing room with anxious faces, while two servants, under directions from Carl, searched the house for Goldie. "If you please'm," stammered the housemaid, rushing rather unconventionally into the drawing room, "cook says she thinks Goldie must be on the roof, in the vane." "On the roof, in the vane!" exclaimed Mrs Ebag, pale. "In the vane?" "Yes'm." "Whatever do you mean, Sarah?" said Miss Ebag, even paler. The ladies Ebag were utterly convinced that Goldie was not like other cats, that he never went on the roof, that he never had any wish to do anything that was not in the strictest sense gentlemanly and correct. And if, by chance, he did go on the roof, it was merely to examine the roof itself, or to enjoy the view therefrom out of gentlemanly curiosity. so that this reference to the roof shocked them. The Knight did not favor the theory of view gazing. "Cook says she heard the weather vane creaking ever since she went upstairs after dinner, and now it's stopped, and she can hear Goldie a meowling like anything." "Is Cook in her attic?" asked Mrs Ebag. "Yes'm." "Ask her to come out. Mr Ullman, will you be so very good as to come upstairs and investigate?" Cook, enveloped in a cloak, stood out on the second landing, while Mr Ullman and the ladies invaded her chamber. The noise of meowling was terrible. Mr Ullman opened the dormer window, and the rain burst in, together with a fury of meowling. But he did not care. It lightened and thundered, but he did not care. He procured a chair of Cook's and put it under the window and stood on it, with his back to the window, and twisted forth his body so that he could spy up the roof. The ladies protested that he would be wet through, but he paid no heed to them. Then his head, dripping, returned into the room. "I've just seen by a flash of lightning," he said in a voice of emotion. "The poor animal has got his tail fast in the socket of the weather vane. He must have been whisking it about up there, and the vane turned and caught it. The vane is jammed." "How dreadful!" said Mrs Ebag. "Whatever can be done?" "He'll be dead before morning," sobbed Miss Ebag. "I shall climb up the roof and release him," said Carl Ullman, gravely. They forbade him to do so. Then they implored him to refrain, but he was adamant. And in their supplications there was a note of insincerity, for their hearts bled for Goldie, and further, they were not altogether unwilling that Carl should prove himself a hero. And so, amid apprehensive feminine cries of the acuteness of his danger, Carl crawled out of the window and faced the thunder, the lightning, the rain, the slippery roof, and the maddened cat. A group of 3 servants were huddled outside the attic door. In the attic the ladies could hear his movements on the roof, moving higher and higher. The suspense was extreme. Then there was silence. Even the meowling had ceased. Then a clap of thunder, and then after that a terrific clatter on the roof, a bounding downwards as of a great stone, a curse, a horrid pause, and finally a terrific smashing of foliage and cracking of wood. Mrs Ebag sprang to the window. "It's all right," came a calm, gloomy voice from below. "I fell into the rhododendrons and Goldie followed me. I'm not hurt, thank goodness. Just my luck." A bell rang imperiously. It was the paralytic's bell. He had been disturbed by these unaccustomed phenomena. "Sister, do go to father at once," said Mrs Ebag, as they both hastened downstairs in a state of emotion assuredly unique in their lives. V. Mrs Ebag met Carl and the cat as they dripped into the gaslit drawing room. They presented a surprising spectacle, and they were doing damage to the Persian carpet at the rate of about 5 shillings a second. But that Carl and the beloved creature for whom he had dared so much were equally unhurt appeared to be indubitable. Of course it was a miracle. It could not be regarded as other than a miracle. Mrs Ebag gave vent to an exclamation in which were mingled pity, pride, admiration, and solicitude, and then remained, as it were, spellbound. The cat escaped from those protecting arms and fled away. Instead of following Goldie, Mrs Ebag continued to gaze at the hero. "How can I thank you?" she whispered. "What for?" asked Carl, with laconic gloom. "For having saved my darling," said Mrs Ebag, and there was passion in her voice. "Oh," said Carl, "it was nothing." "Nothing!" Mrs Ebag repeated after him, with melting eyes, as if to imply that, instead of being nothing, it was everything, as if to imply that his deed must rank hereafter with the most splendid deeds of antiquity, as if to imply that the whole affair was beyond words to utter or gratitude to repay. And in fact, Carl himself was moved. You cannot fall from the roof of a 2-story house into a very high class rhododendron bush carrying a prize cat in your arms without being a bit shaken. And Carl was a bit shaken, not merely physically, but morally and spiritually. He could not deny to himself that he had after all done something rather wondrous, which ought to be celebrated in sounding verse. He felt that he was in an atmosphere far removed from the commonplace. He dripped steadily on to the carpet. "You know how dear my cat was to me," proceeded Mrs Ebag, "and you risked your life to spare me the pain of his suffering, perhaps his death. How thankful I am that I insisted on having those rhododendrons planted just where they are 15 years ago. I never anticipated." She stopped. Tears came into her dowager eyes. It was obvious that she worshipped him. She was so absorbed in his heroism that she had no thought even for his dampness. As Carl's eyes met hers, she seemed to him to grow younger. And there came into his mind all the rumour that had vaguely reached him, coupling their names together, and also his early dreams of love and passion and a marriage that would be one long honeymoon. And he saw how absurd had been those early dreams. He saw that the best chance of a felicitous marriage lay in a union of mature and serious persons, animated by grave interests and lofty ideals. Yes, she was older than he, but not much, not much, not more than how many years? And he remembered surprising her rapt glance that very evening as she watched him playing the piano. What had romance to do with age? Romance could occur at any age. It was occurring now. Her soft eyes, her portly form, exuded romance. And had not the renowned Beaconsfield espoused a lady appreciably older than himself, and did not those espousals achieve the ideal of bliss? In the act of saving the cat he had not been definitely aware that it was so particularly the cat of the household. But now, influenced by her attitude and her shining reverence, he actually did begin to persuade himself that an uncontrollable instinctive desire to please her and win her for his own had moved him to undertake the perilous passage of the sloping roof. In short, the idle chatter of the town was about to be justified. In another moment he might have dripped into her generous arms, had not Miss Ebag swept into the drawing room. "Gracious!" gasped Miss Ebag. "The poor dear thing will have pneumonia. Sister, you know his chest is not strong. Dear Mr Ullman, please, please, do go and change." He did the discreet thing and went to bed, hot whiskey following him on a tray carried by the housemaid. VI. The next morning the slightly unusual happened. It was the custom for Carl Ullman to breakfast alone while reading the Staffordshire Signal. The ladies Ebag breakfasted mysteriously in bed, but on this morning Karl found Miss Ebag before him in the breakfast room. She prosecuted minute inquiries as to his health and nerves. She went out with him to regard the rhododendron bushes, and shuddered at the sight of the ruin which had saved him. She said, following famous philosophers, that chance was merely the name we give to the effect of laws which we cannot understand. And, upon this high level of conversation, she poured forth his coffee and passed his toast. It was a lovely morning after the tempest. Goldie, all newly combed, and looking as though he had never seen a roof, strolled pompously into the room, with tail unfurled. Miss Ebag picked the animal up and kissed it passionately. "Darling!" she murmured, not exactly to Mr Ullman, nor yet exactly to the cat. Then she glanced effulgently at Karl and said, "When I think that you risked your precious life in that awful storm to save my poor Goldie, you must have guessed how dear he was to me. No, really, Mr Ullman, I cannot thank you properly. I can't express my—" Her eyes were moist. Although not young, she was 2 years younger. Her age was 2 years less. The touch of man had never profaned her. No masculine kiss had ever rested on that cheek, that mouth. And Karl felt that he might be the first to cull the flower that had so long waited. He did not see, just then, the hollow beneath her chin, the 2 lines of sinew that, bounding a depression, disappeared beneath her collarette. He saw only her soul. He guessed that she would be more malleable than the widow, and he was sure that she was not in a position, as the widow was, to make comparisons between husbands. Certainly there appeared to be some confusion as to the proprietorship of this cat. Certainly he could not have saved the cat's life for love of 2 different persons. But that was beside the point. The essential thing was that he began to be glad that he had decided nothing definite about the widow on the previous evening. "Darling!" said she again, with a new access of passion, kissing Goldie, but darting a glance at Karl. He might have put to her the momentous question, between 2 bites of buttered toast, had not Mrs Ebag, at the precise instant, swum amply into the room. "Sister, you up?" exclaimed Miss Ebag. "And you, sister?" retorted Mrs Ebag. VII. It is impossible to divine what might have occurred for the delectation of the very ancient borough of Oldcastle if that frivolous piece of goods, Edith, had not taken it into her head to run down from London for a few days, on the plea that London was too ridiculously hot. She was a pretty girl, with fluffy, honey-coloured hair and about 30 white frocks. And she seemed to be quite as silly as her staid stepmother and her prim step-aunt had said. She transformed the careful order of the house into a wild disorder, and left a novel or so lying on the drawing-room table between her stepmother's Contemporary Review and her step-aunt's History of European Morals. Her taste in music was candidly and brazenly bad. It was a fact, as her elders had stated, that she played nothing but waltzes. What was worse, she compelled Karl Ullman to perform waltzes. And one day she burst into the drawing room when Karl was alone there, with a roll under her luscious arm, and said, "What do you think I've found at Barrowfoot's?" "I don't know," said Karl, gloomily smiling, and then smiling without gloom. "Waldteufel's waltzes arranged for 4 hands. You must play them with me at once." And he did. It was a sad spectacle to see the organist of St Placid's galloping through a series of dances with the empty-headed Edith. The worst was, he liked it. He knew that he ought to prefer the high intellectual plane, the severe artistic tastes of the elderly sisters. But he did not. He was amazed to discover that frivolity appealed more powerfully to his secret soul. He was also amazed to discover that his gloom was leaving him. This vanishing of gloom gave him strange sensations, akin to the sensations of a man who, after having worn gaiters into middle age, abandons them. After the vaudeville, she began to tell him all about herself, how she went slumming in the East End, and how jolly it was, and how she helped in the Bloomsbury settlement, and how jolly that was, and later she said, "You must have thought it very odd of me, Mr Ullman, not thanking you for so bravely rescuing my poor cat. But the truth is I never heard of it till to day. I can't say how grateful I am. I should have loved to see you doing it." "Is Goldie your cat?" he feebly inquired. "Why, of course," she said. "Didn't you know? Of course you did. Goldie always belonged to me. Grandpa bought him for me, but I couldn't do with him in London, so I always leave him here for them to take care of. He adores me. He never forgets me. He'll come to me before any one. You must have noticed that. I can't say how grateful I am. It was perfectly marvellous of you. I can't help laughing, though, whenever I think what a state Mother and Auntie must have been in that night." Strictly speaking, they hadn't a cent between them, except his 100 a year. But he married her hair, and she married his melancholy eyes, and she was content to settle in Oldcastle, where there are almost no slums. And her stepmother was forced by Edith to make the 100 up to 400. This was rather hard on Mrs Ebag. Thus it fell out that Mrs Ebag remained a widow, and that Miss Ebag continues a flower uncalled. However, gossip was stifled. In his appointed time, and in the fullness of years, Goldie died, and was mourned. And by none was he more sincerely mourned than by the aged bedridden Caiaphas. "I miss my cat, I can't tell ye," said old Caiaphas pettishly to Carl, who was sitting by his couch. "He knew his master, Goldie did. Edith did her best to steal him from me when you married and set up house. A nice thing considering I bought him and he never belonged to anybody but me. I shall never have another cat like that cat." And this is the whole truth of the affair. End of The Cat and Cupid, by Arnold Bennett.
Chubu and Sheemish, by Lord Dunsany. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chubu and Sheemish. It was the custom on Tuesdays in the temple of Chubu for the priest to enter at evening and chant, "There is none but Chubu." And all the people rejoiced and cried out, "There is none but Chubu." And honey was offered to Chubu, and maize and fat, thus was he magnified. Chubu was an idol of some antiquity, as may be seen from the color of the wood. He had been carved out of mahogany, and after he was carved he had been polished. Then they had set him up on the diorite pedestal with the brazier in front of it for burning spices, and the flat gold plates for fat. Thus they worshipped Chubu. He must have been there for over 100 years, when one day the priest came in with another idol into the temple of Chubu, and set it upon a pedestal near Chubu's, and sang, "There is also Sheemish." and all the people rejoiced and cried out, "There is also Sheemish!" Sheemish was palpably a modern idol, and although the wood was stained with a dark red dye, you could see that he had only just been carved. And honey was offered to Sheemish as well as Chubu, and also maize and fat. The fury of Chubu knew no time limit. He was furious all that night, and next day he was furious still. The situation called for immediate miracles. To devastate the city with a pestilence and kill all his priests was scarcely within his power. Therefore he wisely concentrated such divine powers as he had in commanding a little earthquake. Thus, thought Chubu, will I reassert myself as the only god, and men shall spit upon Sheemish. Chubu willed it, and still no earthquake came, when suddenly he was aware that the hated Sheemish was daring to attempt a miracle too. He ceased to busy himself about the earthquake, and listened, or shall I say felt, for what Sheemish was thinking, for gods are aware of what passes in the mind by a sense that is other than any of our five. Sheemish was trying to make an earthquake too. The new god's motive was probably to assert himself. I doubt if Chubu understood or cared for his motive. It was sufficient for an idol already aflame with jealousy that his detestable rival was on the verge of a miracle. All the power of Chubu veered round at once and set dead against an earthquake, even a little one. It was thus in the temple of Chubu for some time, and then no earthquake came. To be a god and to fail to achieve a miracle is a despairing sensation. It is as though among men one should determine upon a hearty sneeze, and as though no sneeze would come. It was as though one should try to swim in heavy boots, or remember a name that is utterly forgotten. All these pains were Sheemish's. And upon Tuesday the priests came in, and the people, and they did worship Chubu, and offered fat to him, saying, "O Chubu, who made everything." And then the priests sang, "There is also Sheemish." And Chubu was put to shame, and spake not for 3 days. Now there were holy birds in the temple of Chubu, and when the 3rd day was come, and the night thereof, it was, as it were, revealed to the mind of Chubu, that there was dirt upon the head of Sheemish. And Chubu spake unto Sheemish, as speak the gods, moving no lips, nor yet disturbing the silence, saying, "There is dirt upon thy head, O Sheemish." All night long he muttered again and again, "There is dirt upon Sheemish's head." And when it was dawn, and voices were heard far off, Chubu became exultant with earth's awakening things, and cried out till the sun was high, "Dirt, dirt, dirt upon the head of Sheemish." And at noon he said, "So Sheemish would be a god." Thus was Sheemish confounded. And with Tuesday one came and washed his head with rose water, and he was worshipped again when they sang, "There is also Sheemish." And yet was Chubu content, for he said, "The head of Sheemish has been defiled." And again, "His head was defiled, it is enough." And one evening, lo, there was dirt on the head of Chubu also. And the thing was perceived of Sheemish. It is not with the gods as it is with men. We are angry one with another, and turn from our anger again, but the wrath of the gods is enduring. Chubu remembered, and Sheemish did not forget. They spake as we do not speak, in silence yet heard of each other, nor were their thoughts as our thoughts. We should not judge them merely by human standards. All night long they spake, and all night said these words only, "Dirty Chubu, dirty Sheemish, dirty Chubu, dirty Sheemish," all night long. Their wrath had not tired at dawn, and neither had wearied of its accusation, and gradually Chubu came to realize that he was nothing more than the equal of Sheemish. All gods are jealous, but this equality with the upstart Sheemish, a thing of painted wood 100 years newer than Chubu, and this worship given to Sheemish in Chubu's own temple were particularly bitter. Chubu was jealous even for a god, and when Tuesday came again, the 3rd day of Sheemish's worship, Chubu could bear it no longer. He felt that his anger must be revealed at all costs, and he returned with all the vehemence of his will to achieve a little earthquake. The worshippers had just gone from his temple when Chu Bu settled his will to attain this miracle. Now and then his meditations were disturbed by that now familiar dictum, "Dirty Chu Bu." But Chu Bu willed ferociously, not even stopping to say what he longed to say and had already said 900 times, and presently even these interruptions ceased. They ceased because Sheemish had returned to a project that he had never definitely abandoned, the desire to assert himself and exalt himself over Chu Bu by performing a miracle, and the district being volcanic, he had chosen a little earthquake as the miracle most easily accomplished by a small god. Now an earthquake that is commanded by two gods has double the chance of fulfillment than when it is willed by one, and an incalculably greater chance than when two gods are pulling different ways, as, to take the case of older and greater gods, when the sun and the moon pull in the same direction we have the biggest tides. Chu Bu knew nothing of the theory of tides, and was too much occupied with his miracle to notice what Sheemish was doing, and suddenly the miracle was an accomplished thing. It was a very local earthquake, for there are other gods than Chu Bu or even Sheemish, and it was only a little one as the gods had willed, but it loosened some monoliths in a colonnade that supported one side of the temple, and the whole of one wall fell in, and the low huts of the people of that city were shaken a little, and some of their doors were jammed so they would not open. It was enough, and for a moment it seemed that it was all. Neither Chu Bu nor Sheemish commanded there should be more, but they had set in motion an old law, older than Chu Bu, the law of gravity that the colonnade had held back for 100 years, and the temple of Chu Bu quivered, and then stood still, swayed once and was overthrown on the heads of Chu Bu and Sheemish. No one rebuilt it, for nobody dared to near such terrible gods. Some said that Chu Bu wrought the miracle, but some said Sheemish, and thereof schism was born. The weakly amiable, alarmed by the bitterness of rival sects, sought compromise and said that both had wrought it, but no one guessed the truth that the thing was done in rivalry. And a saying arose, and both sects held this belief in common, that whoso toucheth Chu Bu shall die, or whoso looketh upon Sheemish. That is how Chu Bu came into my possession when I travelled once beyond the hills of Ting. I found him in the fallen temple of Chu Bu, with his hands and toes sticking up out of the rubbish, lying upon his back, and in that attitude, just as I found him, I keep him to this day on my mantelpiece, as he is less liable to be upset that way. Sheemish was broken, so I left him where he was. And there is something so helpless about Chu Bu, with his fat hands stuck up in the air, that sometimes I am moved out of compassion to bow down to him and pray, saying, "O Chu Bu, thou that made everything, help thy servant." Chu Bu cannot do much, though once I am sure that at a game of bridge he sent me the ace of trumps after I had not held a card worth having for the whole of the evening. And chance alone could have done as much as that for me, but I do not tell this to Chu Bu. End of Chu Bu and Sheemish by Lord Dunsany. Read by Alan Winterroud.
The District Doctor by Ivan S. Turgenev. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The District Doctor by Ivan S. Turgenev. One day in autumn, on my way back from a remote part of the country, I caught cold and fell ill. Fortunately, the fever attacked me in the district town at the inn. I sent for the doctor. In half an hour the district doctor appeared, a thin, dark-haired man of middle height. He prescribed me the usual sudorific, ordered a mustard plaster to be put on, very deftly slid a 5-rouble note up his sleeve, coughing dryly and looking away as he did so, and then was getting up to go home, but somehow fell into talk and remained. I was exhausted with feverishness. I foresaw a sleepless night, and was glad of a little chat with a pleasant companion. Tea was served. My doctor began to converse freely. He was a sensible fellow, and expressed himself with vigour and some humour. Queer little things happen in the world. You may live a long while with some people, and be on friendly terms with them, and never once speak openly with them from your soul. With others you have scarcely time to get acquainted, and all at once you are pouring out to him, or he to you, all your secrets as though you were at a confession. I don't know how I gained the confidence of my new friend. Anyway, with nothing to lead up to it, he told me a rather curious incident. And here I will report this tale for the information of the indulgent reader. I will try to tell it in the doctor's own words. "You don't happen to know," he began in a weak and quavering voice, the common result of the use of unmixed Berezov snuff, "you don't happen to know the judge here, Mylov, Pavel Lukich? You don't know him? Well, it's all the same." He cleared his throat and rubbed his eyes. "Well, you see, the thing happened, to tell you exactly without mistake, in Lent, at the very time of the thaws. I was sitting at his house, our judge's, you know, playing preference. Our judge is a good fellow and fond of playing preference. Suddenly," the doctor made frequent use of the word suddenly, "they tell me, 'There's a servant asking for you.' I say, 'What does he want?' They say, 'He has brought a note. It must be from a patient.' 'Give me the note,' I say. So it is from a patient. Well and good. You understand, it's our bread and butter. But this is how it was. A lady, a widow, writes to me. She says, 'My daughter is dying. Come, for God's sake.' She says, 'And the horses have been sent for you.' Well, that's all right. But she was 20 miles from the town, and it was midnight out of doors, and the roads in such a state, my word! And as she was poor herself, one could not expect more than 2 silver roubles, and even that problematic, and afterwards it might only be a matter of a roll of linen and a sack of oatmeal in payment. However, duty, you know, before everything. A fellow creature may be dying. I hand over my cards at once to Calliope, the member of the Provincial Commission, and return home. I look. A wretched little trap was standing at the steps, with peasants' horses, fat, too fat, and their coat as shaggy as felt, and the coachman sitting with his cap off out of respect. Well, I think to myself, it's clear, my friend, these patients aren't rolling in riches. You smile, but I tell you, a poor man like me has to take everything into consideration. If the coachman sits like a prince and doesn't touch his cap, and even sneers at you behind his beard, and flicks his whip, then you may bet on 6 roubles. But this case, I saw, had a very different air. However, I think there's no help for it, duty before everything. I snatch up the most necessary drugs and set off. Will you believe it? I only just managed to get there at all. The road was infernal, streams, snow, watercourses, and the dike had suddenly burst there. That was the worst of it. However, I arrived at last. It was a little thatched house. There was a light in the windows. That meant they expected me. I was met by an old lady, very venerable, in a cap. 'Save her,' she says. 'She is dying.' I say, 'Pray don't distress yourself. Where is the invalid?' 'Come this way.' I see a clean little room, a lamp in the corner, on the bed a girl of 20, unconscious. She was in a burning heat and breathing heavily. It was fever. There were 2 other girls, her sisters, scared and in tears. Yesterday, they tell me, she was perfectly well, and had a good appetite. This morning she complained of her head, and this evening, suddenly, you see, like this.' I said again, 'Pray don't be uneasy. It's a doctor's duty, you know.' And I went up to her and bled her, told them to put on a mustard plaster, and prescribed a mixture. Meantime, I looked at her, you know. There, by God, I have never seen such a face. She was a beauty, in a word. I felt quite shaken with pity. Such lovely features, such eyes. But, thank God, she became easier. She fell into a perspiration, seemed to come to her senses, looked round, smiled, and passed her hand over her face. Her sisters bent over her. They ask, 'How are you?' 'All right,' she says, and turns away. I looked at her. She had fallen asleep. 'Well,' I say, 'now the patient should be left alone.' So we all went out on tiptoe. Only a maid remained, in case she was wanted. In the parlour there was a samovar standing on the table, and a bottle of rum. In our profession one can't get on without it. They gave me tea, asked me to stop the night. I consented. Where could I go, indeed, at that time of night? The old lady kept groaning. What is it? I say. She will live. Don't worry yourself. You had better take a little rest yourself. It is about 2 o'clock. But you will send to wake me if anything happens? Yes, yes. The old lady went away, and the girls too went to their own room. They made up a bed for me in the parlour. Well, I went to bed, but I could not get to sleep, for a wonder, for in reality I was very tired. I could not get my patient out of my head. At last I could not put up with it any longer. I got up suddenly. I think to myself, I will go and see how the patient is getting on. Her bedroom was next to the parlour. Well, I got up and gently opened the door. How my heart beat! I looked in. The servant was asleep, her mouth wide open, and even snoring. The wretch! But the patient lay with her face towards me, and her arms flung wide apart, poor girl. I went up to her, when suddenly she opened her eyes and stared at me. "Who is it? Who is it?" I was in confusion. "Don't be alarmed, madam," I say. "I am the doctor. I have come to see how you feel." "You the doctor?" "Yes, the doctor your mother sent for me from the town. We have bled you, madam. Now pray go to sleep, and in a day or two, please God, we will set you on your feet again." "Ah, yes, yes. Doctor, don't let me die. Please, please." "Why do you talk like that, God bless you?" She is in a fever again, I think to myself. I felt her pulse. Yes, she was feverish. She looked at me, and then took me by the hand. "I will tell you why I don't want to die. I will tell you. Now we are alone, and only please don't you, not to any one. Listen." I bent down. She moved her lips quite to my ear. She touched my cheek with her hair. I confess my head went round, and began to whisper. I could make out nothing of it. Ah, she was delirious. She whispered and whispered, but so quickly, and as if it were not in Russian. At last she finished, and shivering dropped her head on the pillow, and threatened me with her finger. "Remember, doctor, to no one." I calmed her somehow, gave her something to drink, waked the servant, and went away. At this point the doctor again took snuff with exasperated energy, and for a moment seemed stupefied by its effects. "However," he continued, "the next day, contrary to my expectations, the patient was no better. I thought and thought, and suddenly decided to remain there, even though my other patients were expecting me. And you know one can't afford to disregard that, one's practice suffers if one does. But, in the first place, the patient was really in danger, and secondly, to tell the truth, I felt strongly drawn to her. Besides, I liked the whole family. Though they were really badly off, they were singularly, I may say, cultivated people. Their father had been a learned man, an author. He died, of course, in poverty, but he had managed before he died to give his children an excellent education. He left a lot of books, too. Either because I looked after the invalid very carefully, or for some other reason, anyway, I can venture to say all the household loved me as if I were one of the family. Meantime, the roads were in a worse state than ever. All communication, so to say, were cut off completely. Even medicine could with difficulty be got from the town. The sick girl was not getting better. Day after day, and day after day. But here," the doctor made a brief pause, "I declare I don't know how to tell you." He again took snuff, coughed, and swallowed a little tea. "I will tell you without beating about the bush. My patient, how should I say? Well, she had fallen in love with me. Or no, it was not that she was in love. However, really, how should one say?" The doctor looked down and grew red. "No," he went on quickly, "in love indeed. A man should not overestimate himself. She was an educated girl, clever and well read, and I had even forgotten my Latin, one may say, completely. As to appearance," the doctor looked himself over with a smile, "I am nothing to boast of there either. But God Almighty did not make me a fool. I don't take black for white. I know a thing or two. I could see very clearly, for instance, that Alexandra Andreyevna, that was her name, did not feel love for me, but had a friendly, so to say, inclination, a respect or something for me, though she herself perhaps mistook this sentiment. Anyway, this was her attitude. You may form your own judgment of it. But," the doctor added, who had brought out all these disconnected sentences without taking breath, and with obvious embarrassment, "I seem to be wandering rather. You won't understand anything like this. There, With your leave, I will relate it all in order." He drank off a glass of tea and began in a calmer voice. "Well, then, my patient kept getting worse and worse. You are not a doctor, my good sir. You cannot understand what passes in a poor fellow's heart, especially at first, when he begins to suspect that the disease is getting the upper hand of him. What becomes of his belief in himself? You suddenly grow timid. It's indescribable. You fancy then that you have forgotten everything you knew, and that the patient has no faith in you, and that other people begin to notice how distracted you are, and tell you the symptoms with reluctance, that they are looking at you suspiciously, whispering. Ah, it's horrid. There must be a remedy, you think, for this disease, if one could find it. Isn't this it? You try. No, that's not it. You don't allow the medicine the necessary time to do good. You clutch at one thing, then at another. Sometimes you take up a book of medical prescriptions. Here it is, you think. Sometimes, by Jove, you pick one out by chance, thinking to leave it to fate. But meantime a fellow creature's dying, and another doctor would have saved him. We must have a consultation, you say. I will not take the responsibility on myself. And what a fool you look at such times! Well, in time you learn to bear it. It's nothing to you. A man has died, but it's not your fault. You treated him by the rules. But what's still more torture to you is to see blind faith in you, and to feel yourself that you are not able to be of use. Well, it was just this blind faith that the whole of Alexandra Andreevna's family had in me. They had forgotten to think that their daughter was in danger. I, too, on my side, assure them that it's nothing, but meantime my heart sinks into my boots. To add to our troubles, the roads were in such a state that the coachman was gone for whole days together to get medicine, and I never left the patient's room. I could not tear myself away. I tell her amusing stories, you know, and play cards with her. I watch by her side at night. The old mother thanks me with tears in her eyes, but I think to myself, I don't deserve your gratitude. I frankly confess to you, there is no object in concealing it now, I was in love with my patient. And Alexandra Andreevna had grown fond of me. She would not sometimes let anyone be in her room but me. She began to talk to me, to ask questions, where I had studied, how I lived, who were my people, whom I go to see. I feel that she ought not to talk, but to forbid her resolutely, you know, I could not. Sometimes I held my head in my hands and asked myself, "What are you doing, villain?" And she would take my hand and hold it, give me a long, long look, and turn away, sigh, and say, "How good you are!" Her hands were so feverish, her eyes so large and languid. "Yes," she says, "you are a good, kind man. You are not like our neighbors. No, you are not like that. Why did I not know you till now?" "Alexandra Andreevna, calm yourself," I say. "I feel, believe me, I don't know how I have gained, but there, calm yourself. All will be right. You will be well again. And meantime, I must tell you," continued the doctor, bending forward and raising his eyebrows, "that they associated very little with the neighbors, because the smaller people were not on their level, and pride hindered them from being friendly with the rich. I tell you, they were an exceptionally cultivated family, so you know it was gratifying for me. She would only take her medicine from my hands. She would lift herself up, poor girl, with my aid, take it, and gaze at me. My heart fell as if it were bursting. And meanwhile she was growing worse and worse, worse and worse, all the time. She will die, I think to myself. She must die. Believe me, I would sooner have gone to the grave myself. And here were her mother and sisters watching me, looking into my eyes, and their faith in me was wearing away. Well, how is she? Oh, all right, all right. All right, indeed. My mind was failing me. Well, I was sitting one night alone again by my patient. The maid was sitting there too, and snoring away in full swing. I can't find fault with the poor girl, though. She was worn out too. Alexandra Andreevna had felt very unwell all the evening. She was feverish. Until midnight she kept tossing about. At last she seemed to fall asleep. At least, she lay still, without stirring. The lamp was burning in the corner before the holy image. I sat there, you know, with my head bent. I even dozed a little. Suddenly it seemed as though someone touched me in the side. I turned round. Good God! Alexandra Andreyevna was gazing with intent eyes at me. Her lips parted, her cheeks seemed burning. "What is it?" "Doctor, shall I die? Merciful heavens!" "No, doctor, no. Please don't tell me I shall live. Don't say so. If you knew Listen, for God's sake don't conceal my real position," and her breath came so fast. "If I can know for certain that I must die, then I will tell you all. Alexandra Andreyevna, I beg. Listen, I have not been asleep at all. I have been looking at you a long while. For God's sake, I believe in you. You are a good man, an honest man. I entreat you, by all that is sacred in the world, tell me the truth. If you knew how important it is for me, doctor, for God's sake, tell me, am I in danger?" "What can I tell you, Alexandra Andreyevna, pray? For God's sake, I beseech you." "I can't disguise from you, I say, Alexandra Andreyevna, you are certainly in danger, but God is merciful. I shall die, I shall die!" And it seemed as though she were pleased. Her face grew so bright, I was alarmed. "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. I am not frightened of death at all." She suddenly sat up and leaned on her elbow. "Now, yes, now I can tell you that I thank you with my whole heart, that you are kind and good, that I love you." I stared at her like one possessed. It was terrible for me, you know. "Do you hear? I love you. Alexandra Andreyevna, how have I deserved No, no, you don't understand me." And suddenly she stretched out her arms, and taking my head in her hands, she kissed it. Believe me, I almost screamed aloud. I threw myself on my knees and buried my head in the pillow. She did not speak. Her fingers trembled in my hair. I listen. She is weeping. I began to soothe her, to assure her. I really don't know what I did say to her. "You will wake up the girl," I say to her. "Alexandra Andreyevna, I thank you, believe me. Calm yourself." "Enough, enough," she persisted. "Never mind all of them. Let them wake, then. Let them come in. It doesn't matter. I am dying, you see. And what do you fear? Why are you afraid? Lift up your head. Or perhaps you don't love me. Perhaps I am wrong. In that case, forgive me." "Alexandra Andreyevna, what are you saying? I love you, Alexandra Andreyevna." She looked straight into my eyes and opened her arms wide. "Then take me in your arms. I tell you frankly, I don't know how it was that I did not go mad that night. I feel that my patient is killing herself. I see that she is not fully herself. I understand, too, that if she did not consider herself on the point of death, she would never have thought of me. And indeed, say what you will, it's hard to die at 20 without having known love. This was what was torturing her. This was why, in despair, she caught at me. Do you understand now? But she held me in her arms, and would not let me go. "Have pity on me, Alexandra Andreyevna, and have pity on yourself," I say. "Why," she says, "what is there to think of? You know I must die." This she repeated incessantly. "If I knew that I should return to life, and be a proper young lady again, I should be ashamed. Of course, ashamed. But why now? But who has said you will die? Oh no, leave off. You will not deceive me. You don't know how to lie. Look at your face." "You shall live, Alexandra Andreyevna. I will cure you. We will ask your mother's blessing. We will be united. We will be happy." "No, no, I have your word. I must die. You have promised me. You have told me." It was cruel for me, cruel for many reasons, and see what trifling things can do sometimes. It seems nothing at all, but it's painful. It occurred to her to ask me, what is my name? Not my surname, but my first name. I must needs be so unlucky as to be called Trifon. Yes, indeed, Trifon Ivanovitch. Everyone in the house called me doctor. However, there's no help for it. I say, "Trifon, madam." She frowned, shook her head, and muttered something in French. Something unpleasant, of course. And then she laughed, disagreeably too. Well, I spent the whole night with her in this way. Before morning I went away, feeling as though I were mad. When I went again into her room, it was daytime, after morning tea. Good God, I could scarcely recognize her. People are laid in their grave looking better than that. I swear to you, on my honor, I don't understand. I absolutely don't understand, now, how I lived through that experience. 3 days and nights my patient still lingered on. And what nights! What things she said to me! And on the last night, only imagine to yourself, I was sitting near her, and kept praying to God for one thing only. Take her, I said, quickly, and me with her. Suddenly the old mother comes unexpectedly into the room. I had already the evening before told her, the mother, there was little hope, and it would be well to send for a priest. When the sick girl saw her mother, she said, "It's very well you have come. Look at us. We love one another. We have given each other our word." "What does she say, doctor? What does she say?" I turned livid. "She is wandering, I say, the fever. But she—" "Hush, hush! You told me something quite different just now, and have taken my ring. Why do you pretend? My mother is good. She will forgive. She will understand. And I am dying. I have no need to tell lies. Give me your hand." I jumped up and ran out of the room. The old lady, of course, guessed how it was. I will not, however, weary you any longer, and to me, too, of course, it's painful to recall all this. My patient passed away the next day. God rest her soul, the doctor added, speaking quickly and with a sigh. Before her death, she asked her family to go out and leave me alone with her. "Forgive me," she said. "I am perhaps to blame towards you, my illness, but, believe me, I have loved no one more than you. Do not forget me. Keep my ring." The doctor turned away. I took his hand. "Ah," he said, "let us talk of something else. Or would you care to play preference for a small stake? It is not for people like me to give way to exalted emotions. There's only one thing for me to think of, how to keep the children from crying and the wife from scolding. Since then, you know, I have had time to enter into lawful wedlock, as they say. Oh, I took a merchant's daughter, 7,000 for her dowry. Her name's Akulina. It goes well with Trifon. She is an ill-tempered woman, I must tell you, but luckily she's asleep all day. Well, shall it be preference?" We sat down to preference for halfpenny points. Trifon Ivanovitch won 2 roubles and a half from me, and went home late, well pleased with his success. End of The District Doctor by Ivan S. Turgenev.
The Eagle's Nest by Björnsson Björnstjerne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Herman Roskams. The Eagle's Nest. The Andrew Guards was the name of a small solitary parish, surrounded by lofty mountains. It lay in a flat and fertile valley, and was intersected by a broad river that flowed down from the mountains. This river emptied into a lake, which was situated close by the parish, and presented a fine view of the surrounding country. Up the Andrew Lake the man had come rowing, who had first cleared this valley. His name was Andre, and it was his descendants who dwelt here. Some said he had fled hither on account of a murder he had committed, and that was why his family were so dark. Others said this was on account of the mountains, which shut out the sun at 5 o'clock of a midsummer afternoon. Over this parish there hung an eagle's nest. It was built on a cliff far up the mountains. All could see the mother eagle alight in her nest, but no one could reach it. The male eagle went sailing over the parish, now swooping down after a lamb, now after a kid. Once he had also taken a little child and borne it away. Therefore there was no safety in the parish as long as the eagle had a nest in this mountain. There was a tradition among the people that in old times there were 2 brothers who had climbed up to the nest and torn it down. But nowadays there was no one who was able to reach it. Whenever 2 met at the end regards, they talked about the eagle's nest and looked up. Everyone knew when the eagles reappeared in the new year, where they had swooped down and done mischief, and who had last endeavored to reach the nest. The youth of the place from early boyhood practiced climbing mountains and trees, wrestling and scuffling in order that one day they might reach the cliff and demolish the nest as those two brothers had done. At the time of which this story tells, the best boy at the entry guards was named Life, and he was not of the Entry family. He had curly hair and small eyes, was clever in all play, and was fond of the fair sex. He early said of himself that one day he would reach the eagle's nest, but old people remarked that he should not have said so aloud. This annoyed him, and even before he had reached his prime, he made the ascent. It was one bright Sunday forenoon, early in the summer. The young eagles must be just about hatched. A vast multitude of people had gathered together at the foot of the mountain to behold the feat, the old people advising him against attempting it, the young ones urging him on. But he hearkened only to his own desires, and, waiting until a mother eagle left her nest, he gave one spring into the air and hung in a tree several yards from the ground. The tree grew in a cleft in the rock, and from this cleft he began to climb upward. Small stones loosened under his feet. Earth and gravel came rolling down, otherwise all was still, save for the stream flowing behind with its suppressed, ceaseless murmur. Soon he had reached the point where the mountain began to project. Here he hung long, by one hand, while his foot groped for a sure resting place, for he could not see. Many, especially women, turned away, saying he would never have done this had he had parents living. He found footing at last, however, sought again, now with the hand, now with the foot, failed, slipped, then hung fast again. They who stood below could hear one another breathing. Suddenly there rose to her feet a tall young girl, who had been sitting on a stone apart from the rest. It was said that she had been betrothed to Life from early childhood, although he was not of her kindred. Stretching out her arms, she called aloud, "Life, Life, why do you do this?" Every eye was turned on her. Her father, who was standing close by, gave her a stern look, but she heeded him not. "Come down again, Life," she cried. "I love you, and there is nothing to be gained up there." They could see that he was considering. He hesitated a moment or two, and then started onward. For a long time all went well, for he was sure-footed and had a strong grip, but after a while it seemed as if he were growing weary, for he often paused. Presently a little stone came rolling down as a harbinger, and every one who stood there had to watch its course to the bottom. Some could endure it no longer and went away. The girl alone still stood on the stone, and, wringing her hands, continued to gaze upward. Once more Life took hold with one hand, but it slipped. She saw this distinctly. Then he tried the other. It slipped also. "Life!" she shouted, so loud that her voice rang through the mountains, and all the others chimed in with her. "He is slipping!" they cried, and stretched up their hands to him, both men and women. He was indeed slipping, carrying with him sand, stones, and earth. Slipping, continually slipping, ever faster and faster. The people turned away, and then they heard a rustling and scraping in the mountain behind them, after which something fell with a heavy thud, like a great piece of wet earth. When they could look round again, he was lying there, crushed and mutilated beyond recognition. The girl had fallen down on the stone, and her father took her up in his arms and bore her away. The youths who had taken the most pains to incite life to the perilous ascent now dared not lend a hand to pick him up. Some were even unable to look at him. So the old people had to go forward. The eldest of them, as he took hold of the body, said, "It is very sad, but," he added, casting a look upward, "it is after all well that something hangs so high that it cannot be reached by everyone." End of The Eagle's Nest, read by Herman Roskams.
The Indigent Brahmin, by Law Bahari Day. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Indigent Brahmin. There was a Brahmin who had a wife and 4 children. He was very poor. With no resources in the world, he lived chiefly on the benefactions of the rich. His gains were considerable when marriages were celebrated or funeral ceremonies were performed. But as his parishioners did not marry every day, neither did they die every day, he found it difficult to make the 2 ends meet. His wife often rebuked him for his inability to give her adequate support, and his children often went about naked and hungry. But though poor, he was a good man. He was diligent in his devotions, and there was not a single day in his life in which he did not say his prayers at stated hours. His tutelary deity was the goddess Durga, the consort of Siva, the creative energy of the universe. On no day did he either drink water or taste food till he had written in red ink the name of Durga at least 108 times, while throughout the day he incessantly uttered the ejaculation, "O Durga, O Durga, have mercy upon me." Whenever he felt anxious on account of his poverty and his inability to support his wife and children, he groaned out, "Durga, Durga, Durga." One day, being very sad, he went to a forest many miles distant from the village in which he lived, and, indulging his grief, wept bitter tears. He prayed in the following manner: "O Durga, O Mother Bhagavati, wilt thou not make an end of my misery? Were I alone in the world, I should not have been sad on account of poverty, but thou hast given me a wife and children. Give me, O Mother, the means to support them." It so happened that on that day and on that very spot the god Siva and his wife Durga were taking their morning walk. The goddess Durga, on seeing the Brahman at a distance, said to her divine husband, "O Lord of Kailas, do you see that Brahman? He is always taking my name on his lips and offering the prayer that I should deliver him out of his troubles. Can we not, my lord, do something for the poor Brahman, oppressed as he is with the cares of a growing family? We should give him enough to make him comfortable. As the poor man and his family have never enough to eat, I propose that you give him a handi, which should yield him an inexhaustible supply of mudki." The lord of Kailas readily agreed to the proposal of his divine consort, and by his decree created on the spot a handi possessing the required quality. Durga then, calling the Brahman to her, said, "O Brahman, I have often thought of your pitiable case. Your repeated prayers have at last moved my compassion. Here is a handi for you. When you turn it upside down and shake it, it will pour down a never ceasing shower of the finest mudki, which will not end till you restore the handi to its proper position. Yourself, your wife, and your children can eat as much mudki as you like, and you can also sell as much as you like." The Brahman, delighted beyond measure at obtaining so inestimable a treasure, made obeisance to the goddess, and taking the handi in his hand, proceeded towards his house as fast as his legs could carry him. But he had not gone many yards when he thought of testing the efficacy of the wonderful vessel. Accordingly, he turned the handi upside down and shook it, when, lo and behold, a quantity of the finest mudki he had ever seen fell to the ground. He tied the sweetmeat in his sheet and walked on. It was now noon, and the Brahman was hungry, but he could not eat without his ablutions and his prayers. As he saw in the way an inn, and not far from it a tank, he purposed to halt there that he might bathe, say his prayers, and then eat the much desired mudki. The Brahman sat at the innkeeper's shop, put the handi near him, smoked tobacco, besmeared his body with mustard oil, and before proceeding to bathe in the adjacent tank, gave the handi in charge to the innkeeper, begging him again and again to take especial care of it. When the Brahman went to his bath and his devotions, the innkeeper thought it strange that he should be so careful as to the safety of his earthen vessel. There must be something valuable in the handi, he thought, otherwise why should the Brahman take so much thought about it? His curiosity being excited, he opened the handi, and to his surprise found that it contained nothing. "What can be the meaning of this?" thought the innkeeper within himself. "Why should the Brahman care so much for an empty handi?" He took up the vessel and began to examine it carefully, and when, in the course of examination, he turned the handi upside down, a quantity of the finest mudki fell from it, and went on falling without intermission. The innkeeper called his wife and children to witness this unexpected stroke of good fortune. The showers of the sugared fried paddy were so copious that they filled all the vessels and jars of the innkeeper. He resolved to appropriate to himself this precious handi, and accordingly put in its place another handi of the same size and make. The ablutions and devotions of the Brahman being now over, he came to the shop in wet clothes, reciting holy texts of the Vedas. Putting on dry clothes, he wrote on a sheet of paper the name of Durga 108 times in red ink. After which he broke his fast on the mudki his handi had already given him. Thus refreshed, and being about to resume his journey homewards, he called for his handi, which the innkeeper delivered to him, adding, "There, sir, is your handi. It is just where you put it. No one has touched it." The Brahman, without suspecting anything, took up the handi and proceeded on his journey. And as he walked on, he congratulated himself on his singular good fortune. "How agreeably," he thought within himself, "will my poor wife be surprised! How greedily the children will devour the mudki of heaven's own manufacture! I shall soon become rich, and lift up my head with the best of them all." The pains of travelling were considerably alleviated by these joyful anticipations. He reached his house, and calling his wife and children, said, "Look now at what I have brought. This handi that you see is an unfailing source of wealth and contentment. You will see what a stream of the finest mudki will flow from it when I turn it upside down." The Brahman's good wife, hearing of mudki falling from the handi unceasingly, thought that her husband must have gone mad, and she was confirmed in her opinion when she found that nothing fell from the vessel, though it was turned upside down again and again. Overwhelmed with grief, the Brahman concluded that the innkeeper must have played a trick with him. He must have stolen the handi Durga had given him, and put a common one in its stead. He went back the next day to the innkeeper, and charged him with having changed his handi. The innkeeper put on a fit of anger, expressed surprise at the Brahman's impudence in charging him with theft, and drove him away from his shop. The Brahman then bethought himself of an interview with the goddess Durga, who had given him the handi, and accordingly went to the forest where he had met her. Siva and Durga again favored the Brahman with an interview. Durga said, "So you have lost the handi I gave you. Here is another. Take it and make good use of it." The Brahman, elated with joy, made obeisance to the divine couple, took up the vessel and went on his way. He had not gone far when he turned it upside down and shook it in order to see whether any mudki would fall from it. Horror of horrors! Instead of sweetmeats, about a score of demons, of gigantic size and grim visage, jumped out of the handi, and began to belabor the astonished Brahman with blows, fisticuffs, and kicks. He had the presence of mind to turn up the handi and to cover it, when the demons forthwith disappeared. He concluded that this new handi had been given him only for the punishment of the innkeeper. He accordingly went to the innkeeper, gave him the new handi in charge, begged of him carefully to keep it till he returned from his ablutions and prayers. The innkeeper, delighted with this second godsend, called his wife and children, and said, "This is another handi brought here by the same Brahman who brought the handi of mudki. This time I hope it is not mudki, but sandisa. Come, be ready with baskets and vessels, and I'll turn the handi upside down and shake it." This was no sooner done than scores of fierce demons started up, who caught hold of the innkeeper and his family and belabored them mercilessly. They also began upsetting the shop, and would have completely destroyed it, if the victims had not besought the Brahman, who had by this time returned from his ablutions, to show mercy to them and send away the terrible demons. The Brahman acceded to the innkeeper's request. He dismissed the demons by shutting up the vessel. He got the former handi, and with the two handis went to his native village. On reaching home, the Brahman shut the door of his house, turned the mudki handi upside down, and shook it. The result was an unceasing stream of the finest mudki that any confectioner in the country could produce. The man, his wife, and their children devoured the sweetmeat to their heart's content. All the available earthen pots and pans of the house were filled with it, and the Brahman resolved the next day to turn confectioner, to open a shop in his house and sell mudki. On the very day the shop was opened, the whole village came to the Brahman's house to buy the wonderful mudki. They had never seen such mudki in their life. It was so sweet, so white, so large, so luscious. No confectioner in the village or any town in the country had ever manufactured anything like it. The reputation of the Brahman's mudki extended, in a few days, beyond the bounds of the village, and people came from remote parts to purchase it. Cartloads of the sweetmeat were sold every day, and the Brahman in a short time became very rich. He built a large brick house, and lived like a nobleman of the land. Once, however, his property was about to go to wreck and ruin. His children one day by mistake shook the wrong handi, when a large number of demons dropped down and caught hold of the Brahman's wife and children, and were striking them mercilessly, when happily the Brahman came into the house and turned up the handi. In order to prevent a similar catastrophe in future, the Brahman shut up the demon handi in a private room, to which his children had no access. Pure and uninterrupted prosperity, however, is not the lot of mortals, and though the demon handi was put aside, what security was there that an accident might not befall the mudki handi? One day, during the absence of the Brahman and his wife from the house, the children decided upon shaking the handi, but as each of them wished to enjoy the pleasure of shaking it, there was a general struggle to get it, and in the mêlée the handi fell to the ground and broke. It is needless to say that the Brahman, when on reaching home he heard of the disaster, became inexpressibly sad. The children were of course well cudgelled, but no flogging of children could replace the magical handi. After some days He again went to the forest and offered many a prayer for Durga's favor. At last Siva and Durga again appeared to him, and heard how the handi had been broken. Durga gave him another handi, accompanied with the following caution: "Brahman, take care of this handi. If you again break it or lose it, I'll not give you another." The Brahman made obeisance, and went away to his house at one stretch without halting anywhere. On reaching home, he shut the door of his house, called his wife to him, turned the handi upside down, and began to shake it. They were only expecting mudki to drop from it, but instead of mudki, a perennial stream of beautiful sandesa issued from it. And such sandesa! No confectioner of Burabasa had ever made its like. It was more the food of gods than of men. The Brahman forthwith set up a shop for selling sandesa, the fame of which soon drew crowds of customers from all parts of the country. At all festivals, at all marriage feasts, at all funeral celebrations, at all pujas, no one bought any other sandesa than the Brahmans. Every day and every hour, many jars of gigantic size, filled with the delicious sweetmeat, were sent to all parts of the country. The wealth of the Brahman excited the envy of the Zemindar of the village, who, having heard that the sandesa was not manufactured but dropped from a handi, devised a plan for getting possession of the miraculous vessel. At the celebration of his son's marriage he held a great feast, to which were invited hundreds of people. As many mountain loads of sandesa would be required for the purpose, the Zemindar proposed that the Brahman should bring the magical handi to the house in which the feast was held. The Brahman at first refused to take it there, but as the Zemindar insisted on its being carried to his own house, he reluctantly consented to take it there. After many Himalayas of sandesa had been shaken out, the handi was taken possession of by the Zemindar, and the Brahman was insulted and driven out of the house. The Brahman, without giving vent to anger in the least, quietly went to his house, and taking the demon handi in his hand, came back to the door of the Zemindar's house. He turned the handi upside down and shook it, on which 100 demons started up as from the vasty deep, and enacted a scene which it is impossible to describe. The hundreds of guests that had been bidden to the feast were caught hold of by their unearthly visitants and beaten. The women were dragged by their hair from the zenana and dashed about amongst the men, while the big and burly Zemindar was driven about from room to room like a bale of cotton. If the demons had been allowed to do their will only for a few minutes longer, all the men would have been killed, and the very house razed to the ground. The Zemindar fell prostrate at the feet of the Brahman and begged for mercy. Mercy was shown him, and the demons were removed. After that, the Brahman was no more disturbed by the Zemindar or by any one else, and he lived many years in great happiness and enjoyment. Thus my story endeth. The Natiya thorn withereth, etc. End of The Indigent Brahman by Lal Bahari Day.
The Missing Mortgagee by R. Austin Freeman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Mortgagee, Part 1. Early in the afternoon of a warm, humid November day, Thomas Elton sauntered dejectedly along the Margate esplanade, casting an eye now on the slate-colored sea with its pall of slate-colored sky, and now on the harbour, where the ebb tide was just beginning to expose the mud. It was a dreary prospect, and Elton varied it by observing the few fishermen and fewer promenaders who walked foot to foot with their distorted reflections in the wet pavement. And thus it was that his eye fell on a smartly dressed man who had just stepped into a shelter to light a cigar. A contemporary joker has classified the Scotsmen who abound in South Africa into two groups, those, namely, who hail from Scotland, and those who hail from Palestine. Now something in the aspect of the broad back that was presented to his view in that of the curly black hair and the exuberant raiment, suggested to Elton a Scotsman of the latter type. In fact, there was a suspicion of disagreeable familiarity in the figure which caused him to watch it and slacken his pace. The man backed out of the shelter, diffusing azure clouds, and drawing an envelope from his pocket, read something that was written on it. Then he turned quickly, and so did Elton, but not quickly enough, for he was a solitary figure on that bold and empty expanse, and the other had seen him at the first glance. Elton walked away slowly, but he had not gone a dozen paces when he felt the anticipated slap on the shoulder and heard the too well-remembered voice. "Blow me if I don't believe you were trying to cut me, Tom," it said. Elton looked around with ill-assumed surprise. "Hello, Gordon! Who the deuce would have thought of seeing you here?" Gordon laughed thickly. "Not you, apparently, and you don't look as pleased as you might now you have seen me, whereas I'm delighted to see you and especially to see that things are going so well with you." "What do you mean?" asked Elton. "Taking your winter holiday by the sea like a blooming duke." "I'm not taking a holiday," said Elton. "I was so worn out that I had to have some sort of change, but I've brought my work down with me, and I put in a full 7 hours every day." "That's right," said Gordon. "Consider the ant. Nothing like steady industry. I brought my work down with me too, a little slip of paper with a stamp on it. You know the article, Tom." "I know, but it isn't due till tomorrow, is it?" "Isn't it, by gum? It's due this very day, the 20th of the month. That's why I'm here. Knowing your little weakness in the matter of dates, and having a small item to collect in Canterbury, I thought I'd just come on and save you the useless expense that results from forgetfulness." Elton understood the hint, and his face grew rigid. "I can't do it, Gordon. I really can't. Haven't got it and shan't have it till I'm paid for the batch of drawings that I'm working on now." "Oh, but what a pity!" exclaimed Gordon, taking the cigar from his thick, pouting lips to utter the exclamation. "Here you are, bluing your capital on seaside jaunts and reducing your income at a stroke by a clear £4 a year." "How do you make that out?" demanded Elton. "Tut, tut," protested Gordon. "What an unbusinesslike chap you are. Here's a little matter of £20, quarters interest. If it's paid now, it's 20. If it isn't, it goes on to the principal, and there's another £4 a year to be paid. Why don't you try to be more economical, dear boy?" Elton looked askance at the vampire by his side, at the plump, blue-shaven cheeks, the thick black eyebrows, the drooping nose, and the full red lips that embraced the cigar, and though he was a mild-tempered man, he felt that he could have battered that sensual, complacent face out of all human likeness, with something uncommonly like enjoyment. But of these thoughts nothing appeared in his reply, for a man cannot afford to say all he would wish to a creditor who could ruin him with a word. "You mustn't be too hard on me, Gordon," said he. "Give me a little time. I'm doing all I can, you know. I earn every penny that I am able, and I have kept my insurance paid up regularly. I shall be paid for this work in a week or two, and then we can settle up." Gordon made no immediate reply, and the two men walked slowly eastward, a curiously ill-assorted pair, the one prosperous, jaunty, overdressed, the other pale and dejected, and with his well-brushed but napless clothes, his patched boots, and shiny-brimmed hat the very type of decent, struggling poverty. They had just passed the pier, and were coming to the base of the jetty when Gordon next spoke. "Can't we get off this beastly wet pavement?" he asked, looking down at his dainty and highly polished boots. "What's it like down on the sands?" "Oh, it's very good walking," said Elton. "Between here and Foreness, and probably drier than the pavement." "Then," said Gordon, "I vote we go down." And accordingly they descended the sloping way beyond the jetty. The stretch of sand left by the retiring tide was as smooth and firm as a sheet of asphalt, and far more pleasant to walk upon. "We seem to have the place all to ourselves," remarked Gordon, "with the exception of some half-dozen dukes like yourself." As he spoke, he cast a cunning black eye furtively at the dejected man by his side, considering how much further squeezing was possible, and what would be the probable product of a further squeeze. But he quickly averted his gaze as Elton turned on him with a look eloquent of contempt and dislike. There was another pause, for Elton made no reply to the last observation. Then Gordon changed over from one arm to the other the heavy fur overcoat that he was carrying. "Needn't have brought this beastly thing," he remarked, "if I'd known it was going to be so warm." "Shall I carry it for you a little way?" asked the naturally polite Elton. "If you would, dear boy," replied Gordon. "It's difficult to manage an overcoat, an umbrella, and cigar all at once." He handed over the coat with a sigh of relief, and having straightened himself and expanded his chest, remarked, "I suppose you're beginning to do quite well now, Tom?" Elton shook his head gloomily. "No," he answered, "it's the same old grind." "But surely they're beginning to recognize your talents by this time," said Gordon, with a persuasive air of a counsel. "That's just the trouble," said Elton. "You see, I haven't any, and they recognized the fact long ago. I'm just a journeyman, and journeyman's work is what I get given to me." "You mean to say that the editors don't appreciate talent when they see it?" "I don't know about that," said Elton, "but they're most infernally appreciative of the lack of it." Gordon blew out a great cloud of smoke, and raised his eyebrows reflectively. "Do you think," he said after a brief pause, "you give 'em a fair chance? I've seen some of your stuff. It's bloomin' prim, you know. Why don't you try something more lively? More skittish, you know, old chap. Something with legs, you know, and high shoes. See what I mean, old chap? High, with good full calves and not too fat in the ankle. That ought to fetch 'em, don't you think so?" Elton scowled. "You're thinking of the drawings in 'Hold Me Up,'" he said scornfully. "But you're mistaken. Any fool can draw a champagne bottle upside down with a French shoe at the end of it." "No doubt, dear boy," said Gordon, "but I expect that sort of fool knows what pays." "A good many fools seem to know that much," retorted Elton, and then he was sorry he had spoken, for Gordon was not really an amiable man, and the expression of his face suggested that he had read a personal application into the rejoinder. So once more the two men walked on in silence. Presently their footsteps led them to the margin of the weed-covered rocks, and here, from under a high heap of bladder wrack, a large green shore crab rushed out and menaced them with uplifted claws. Gordon stopped and stared at the creature with cockney surprise, prodding it with his umbrella and speculating aloud as to whether it was good to eat. The crab, as if alarmed at the suggestion, suddenly darted away and began to scuttle over the green-clad rocks, finally plunging into a large, deep pool. Gordon pursued it, hobbling awkwardly over the slippery rocks until he came to the edge of the pool, over which he stooped, raking inquisitively among the weedy fringe with his umbrella. He was so much interested in his quarry that he had failed to allow for the slippery surface on which he stood. The result was disastrous. Of a sudden one foot began to slide forward, and when he tried to recover his balance, was instantly followed by the other. For a moment he struggled frantically to regain his footing, executing a sort of splashing, stamping dance on the margin. Then the circling seabirds were startled by a yell of terror, an ivory-handled umbrella flew across the rocks, and Mr. Solomon Gordon took a complete header into the deepest part of the pool. What the crab thought of it history does not relate. What Mr. Gordon thought of it is as unsuitable for publication, but as he rose, like an extremely up-to-date merman, he expressed his sentiments with a wealth of adjectives that brought Elton in the verge of hysteria. "It's a good job you brought your overcoat after all," Elton remarked, for the sake of saying something, and thereby avoiding the risk of exploding into undeniable laughter. The Hebrew made no reply, at least, no reply that lends itself to verbatim report, but staggered toward the hospitable overcoat, holding out his dripping arms. Having inducted him into the garment and buttoned him up, Elton hurried off to recover the umbrella, and, incidentally, to indulge himself in a broad grin, and having secured it, angled with it for the smart billycock which was floating across the pool. It was surprising what a change the last minute or two had wrought. The position of the two men were now quite reversed. Despite his shabby clothing, Elton seemed to walk quite jauntily as compared with his shuddering companion, who trotted by his side with short, miserable steps. Shrinking into the uttermost depths of his enveloping coat, like an alarmed winkle into its shell, puffing out his cheeks, and anathematizing the universe in general as well as his chattering teeth would let him. For some time they hurried along towards the slope by the jetty without exchanging any further remarks. Then suddenly Elton asked, "What are you going to do, Gordon? You can't travel like that." "Can't you lend me a change?" asked Gordon. Elton reflected. He had another suit, his best suit, which he had been careful to preserve in good condition for use on those occasions when a decent appearance was indispensable. He looked askance at the man by his side, and something told him that the treasured suit would probably receive less careful treatment than it was accustomed to. Still, the man couldn't be allowed to go about in wet clothes. "I've got a spare suit," he said. "It isn't quite up to your style, and may not be much of a fit, but I dare say you'll be able to put up with it for an hour or two." "It'll be dry, anyhow," mumbled Gordon, "so we won't trouble about the style. How far is it to your rooms?" The plural number was superfluous. Elton's room was in a little ancient flint house at the bottom of a narrow close in the old quarter of the town. You reached it without any formal preliminaries of bell or knocker, by simply letting yourself in by a street door, crossing a tiny room, opening the door of what looked like a narrow cupboard, and squeezing up a diminutive flight of stairs, which was unexpectedly exposed to view. By following this procedure, the two men reached a small bed-sitting room, that is to say, it was a bedroom, but by sitting down on the bed you converted it into a sitting room. Gordon puffed out his cheeks and looked round distastefully. "You might just ring for some hot water, old chappie," he said. Elton laughed aloud. "Ring!" he exclaimed. "Ring what? Your clothes are the only things that are likely to get wrung." "Well, then, sing out for the servant," said Gordon. Elton laughed again. "My dear fellow," said he, "we don't go in for servants. There's only my landlady, and she never comes up here. She's too fat to get up the stairs, and besides, she's got a game leg. I look after my room myself. You'll be all right if you have a good rub-down." Gordon groaned and emerged reluctantly from the depths of his overcoat, while Elton brought forth from the chest of drawers the promised suit and the necessary undergarments. One of these latter Gordon held up with a sour smile, as he regarded it with extreme disfavour. "I shouldn't think," said he, "you need to have been at the trouble of marking them so plainly. No one's likely to want to run away with them." The undergarments certainly contrasted very unfavourably with the delicate garments which he was peeling off, except in one respect: they were dry, and that had to console him for the ignominious change. The clothes fitted quite fairly, notwithstanding the difference between the figures of the two men, for while Gordon was a slender man grown fat, Elton was a broad man grown thin, which, in a way, averaged their superficial area. Elton watched the process of investment and noted the caution with which Gordon smuggled the various articles from his own pockets into those of the borrowed garments without exposing them to view, heard the jingle of money, saw the sumptuous gold watch and massive chain transplanted, and noted with interest the large leather wallet that came forth from the breast pocket of the wet coat. He got a better view of this from the fact that Gordon himself examined it narrowly, and even opened it to inspect the contents. "Luckily that wasn't an ordinary pocket-book," he remarked. "If it had been, your receipt would have got wet, and so would one or two other little articles that wouldn't have been improved by salt water. And, talking of the receipt, Tom, shall I hand it over now?" "You can if you like," said Elton, "but as I told you, I haven't got the money." On which Gordon muttered, "Pity, pity," and thrust the wallet into his, or rather Elton's, breast pocket. A few minutes later the two men came out together into the gathering darkness, and as they walked slowly up the close, Elton asked, "Are you going up to town tonight, Gordon?" "How can I?" was the reply. "I can't go without my clothes. No, I shall run over to Broadstairs. A client of mine keeps a boarding house there. He'll have to put me up for the night, and if you can get my clothes cleaned and dried, I can come over for them tomorrow." These arrangements having been settled, the two men adjourned, at Gordon's suggestion, for tea at one of the restaurants on the front, and after that, again at Gordon's suggestion, they set forth together along the cliff path that leads to Broadstairs by way of Kingsgate. "You may as well walk with me into Broadstairs," said Gordon. "I'll stand you the fare back by rail." And to this Elton had agreed, not because he was desirous of the other man's company, but because he still had some lingering hopes of being able to adjust the little difficulty respecting the instalment. He did not, however, open the subject at once. Profoundly as he loathed and despised the human spider whom necessity made his associate for the moment, he exerted himself to keep up a current of amusing conversation. It was not easy, for Gordon, like most men whose attention is focused on the mere requirement of money, looked with a dull eye on the ordinary aspects of life. His tastes in art he had already hinted at, and his other tastes lay much in the same direction. Money first, for its own sake, and then those coarser and more primitive gratifications that it was capable of purchasing. This was the horizon that bounded Mr. Solomon Gordon's field of vision. Nevertheless, they were well on their way before Elton alluded to the subject that was uppermost in both their minds. "Look here, Gordon," he said at length, "can't you manage to give me a bit more time to pay up this installment? It doesn't seem quite fair to keep sending up the principal like this." "Well, dear boy," replied Gordon, "it's your own fault, you know. If you would only bear the dates in mind, it wouldn't happen." "But," pleaded Elton, "just consider what I'm paying you. I originally borrowed £50 from you, and now I'm paying you £8 a year in addition to the insurance premium. That's close on 100 a year, just about half what I managed to earn by slaving like a nigger. If you stick it up any further, you won't leave me with enough to keep body and soul together, which really means that I shan't be able to pay you at all." There was a brief pause. Then Gordon said dryly, "You talk about not paying, dear boy, as if you had forgotten about that promissory note." Elton set his teeth. His temper was rising rapidly, but he restrained himself. "I should have a pretty poor memory if I had," he replied, "considering the number of reminders you've given me." "You've needed them, Tom," said the other. "I've never met a slacker man in keeping to his engagements." At this Elton lost his temper completely. "That's a damned lie!" he exclaimed. "And you know it, you infernal, dirty, blood-sucking parasite—" Gordon stopped dead. "Look here, my friend," said he, "none of that. If I've any of your damned sauce, I'll give you a sound good hammering." "The deuce you will," said Elton, whose fingers were itching, not for the first time, to take some recompense for all that he had suffered from the insatiable usurer. "Nothing's preventing you now, you know, but I fancy cent per cent is more in your line than fighting." "Give me any more sauce and you'll see," said Gordon. "Very well," was the quiet rejoinder. "I have great pleasure in informing you that you are a human maw-worm. How does that suit you?" For reply, Gordon threw down his overcoat and umbrella on the grass at the side of the path and deliberately slapped Elton on the cheek. The reply followed instantly in the form of a smart left-hander, which took effect on the bridge of the Hebrew's rather prominent nose. Thus the battle was fairly started, and it proceeded with all the fury of accumulated hatred on the one side and sharp physical pain on the other. What little science there was appertained to Elton, in spite of which, however, he had to give way to his heavier, better nourished, and more excitable opponent. Regardless of the punishment he received, the infuriated Jew rushed at him, and by sheer weight of onslaught drove him backward across the little green. Suddenly Elton, who knew the place by daylight, called out in alarm, "Look out, Gordon! Get back, you fool!" But Gordon, blind with fury, and taking this as an attempt to escape, only pressed him harder. Elton's pugnacity died out instantly in mortal terror. He shouted out another warning, and as Gordon still pressed him, battered furiously, he did the only thing that was possible. He dropped to the ground. And then, in the twinkling of an eye, came the catastrophe. Borne forward by his own momentum, Gordon stumbled over Elton's prostrate body, staggered forward a few paces, and fell. Elton heard a muffled groan that faded quickly, and mingled with the sound of falling earth and stones. He sprang to his feet, and looked round and saw that he was alone. For some moments he was dazed by the suddenness of the awful thing that had happened. He crept timorously towards the unseen edge of the cliff and listened. There was no sound save the distant surge of the breakers, and the scream of an invisible seabird. It was useless to try to look over. Near as he was, he could not, even now, distinguish the edge of the cliff from the dark beach below. Suddenly he bethought him of a narrow cutting that led down from the cliff to the shore. Quickly crossing the green, and mechanically stooping to pick up Gordon's overcoat and umbrella, he made his way to the head of the cutting and ran down the rough chalk roadway. At the bottom he turned to the right, and striding hurriedly over the smooth sand, peered into the darkness at the foot of the cliff. Soon there loomed up against that murky sky the shadowy form of the little headland on which he and Gordon had stood, and almost at the same moment there grew out of the darkness of the beach a darker spot amidst a constellation of smaller spots of white. As he drew nearer, the dark spot took shape, a horrid shape with sprawling limbs and a head strangely awry. He stepped forward trembling and spoke the name that the thing had borne. He grasped the flabby hand and laid his fingers on the wrist, but it only told him the same tale as did that strangely misplaced head. The body lay face downwards, and he had not the courage to turn it over. But that his enemy was dead he had not the faintest doubt. He stood up amidst the litter of fallen chalk and earth and looked down at the horrible, motionless thing, wondering numbly and vaguely what he should do. Should he go and seek assistance? The answer to that came in another question. How came that body to be lying on the beach? And what answer should he give to the inevitable question? And swiftly there grew up in his mind, born of the horror of the thing that was, a yet greater horror of the thing that might be. A minute later, a panic-stricken man stole with stealthy swiftness up the narrow cutting and set forth towards Margate, stopping anon to listen, and stealing away off the path into the darkness to enter the town by the inland road. Little sleep was there that night for Elton in his room in the old flint house. The dead man's clothes, which greeted him on his arrival, hanging limply on the towel horse where he had left them, haunted him through the night. In the darkness the sour smell of damp cloth assailed him with an endless reminder of their presence, and after each brief doze he would start up in alarm and hastily light his candle, only to throw its flickering light on those dank, drowned-looking vestments. His thoughts, half controlled, as night thoughts are, flitted erratically from the unhappy past to the unstable present, and thence to the incalculable future. Once he lighted the candle specially to look at his watch to see if the tide had yet crept up to that solitary figure on the beach, nor could he rest again until the time of high water was well past. And all through these wanderings of his thoughts there came, recurring like a horrible refrain, the question of what would happen when the body was found. Could he be connected with it, and if so, would he be charged with murder? At last he fell asleep and slumbered on until the landlady thumped at the staircase door to announce that she had brought his breakfast. As soon as he was dressed he went out. Not, however, until he had stuffed Gordon's still damp clothes and boots, the cumbrous overcoat, and the smart billycock hat into his trunk, and put the umbrella into the darkest corner of the cupboard. Not that anyone ever came up to the room, but that already he was possessed with the uneasy secretiveness of the criminal. He went straight down to the beach, with what purpose he could hardly have said, but an irresistible impulse drove him thither to see if it was there. He went down by the jetty and struck out eastward over the smooth sand, looking about him with dreadful expectation for some small crowd or hurrying messenger. From the foot of the cliffs, over the rocks to the distant line of breakers, his eye roved with eager dread, and still he hurried eastward, always drawing nearer to the place that he feared to look on. As he left the town behind, so he left behind the one or two idlers on the beach, and when he turned Foreness Point he lost sight of the last of them and went forward alone. It was less than half an hour later that the fatal headland opened out beyond Whiteness. Not a soul had he met along that solitary beach, and though once or twice he had started at the sight of some mass of driftwood or heap of seaweed, the dreadful thing that he was seeking had not yet appeared. He passed the opening of the cutting and approached the headland, breathing fast and looking about him fearfully. Already he could see the larger clumps of chalk that had fallen, and looking up, he saw a clean white patch at the summit of the cliff. But still there was no sign of the corpse. He walked on more slowly now, considering whether it could have drifted out to sea, or whether he should find it in the next bay. And then, rounding the headland, he came in sight of a black hole at the cliff foot, the entrance to a deep cave. He approached yet more slowly, sweeping his eye round the little bay, and looking apprehensively at the cavity before him. Suppose the thing should have washed in there. It was quite possible. Many things did wash into that cave, for he had once visited it and had been astonished at the quantity of seaweed and jetsam that had accumulated within it. But it was an uncomfortable thought. It would be doubly horrible to meet the awful thing in the dim twilight of the cavern. And yet the black archway seemed to draw him on, step by step, until he stood at the portal and looked in. It was an eerie place, chilly and damp, the clammy walls and roofs stained green and purple and black with encrusted lichens. At one time Elton had been told it used to be haunted by smugglers, and then communicated with an underground passage, and the old smugglers' lookout still remained. A narrow tunnel high up the cliff, looking out into Kingsgate Bay, and even some vestiges of the rude steps that led up to the lookout platform could still be traced, and were not impossible to climb. Indeed, Elton had, at his last visit, climbed to the platform and looked out through the spy hole. He recalled the circumstance now, as he stood peering nervously into the darkness and straining his eyes to see what jetsam the ocean had brought since then. At first he could see nothing but the smooth sand near the opening. Then, as his eyes grew more accustomed to the gloom, he could make out the great heap of seaweed on the floor of the cave. Insensibly he crept in, with his eyes riveted on the weedy mass, and as he left the daylight behind him, so did the twilight of the cave grow clearer. His feet left the firm sand and trod the springy mass of weed, and in the silence of the cave he could now hear plainly the rain-like patter of the leaping sand-hoppers. He stopped for a moment to listen to the unfamiliar sound, and still the gloom of the cave grew lighter to his more accustomed eyes. And then, in an instant, he saw it. From a heap of weed a few paces ahead projected a boot, his own boot. He recognized the patch on the sole, and at the sight his heart seemed to stand still. Though he had somehow expected to find it here, its presence seemed to strike him with a greater shock of horror from that very circumstance. He was standing stock still, gazing with fearful fascination at the boot and the swelling mound of weed, when suddenly there struck upon his ear the voice of a woman singing. He started violently. His first impulse was to run out of the cave, but a moment's reflection told him what madness this would be. And then the voice drew nearer, and there broke out the high, rippling laughter of a child. Elton looked in terror at the bright opening of the cavern's mouth, expecting every moment to see it frame a group of figures. If that happened he was lost, for he would have been seen actually with the body. Suddenly he bethought him of the spy hole and the platform, both of which were invisible from the entrance, and turning, he ran quickly over the sodden weed till he came to the remains of the steps. Climbing hurriedly up these, he reached the platform, which was enclosed in a large niche, just as the reverberating sound of voices told him that the strangers were within the mouth of the cave. He strained his ears to catch what they were saying, and to make out if they were entering farther. It was a child's voice that he had first heard, and very weird were the hollow echoes of the thin treble that were flung back from the rugged walls. But he could not hear what the child had said. The woman's voice, however, was quite distinct, and the words seemed significant in more senses than one. "No, dear," it said, "you had better not go in. It's cold and damp. Come out into the sunshine." Elton breathed more freely. But the woman was more right than she knew. It was cold and damp, that thing under the black tangle of weed. Better far to be out in the sunshine. He himself was already longing to escape from the chill and gloom of the cavern. But he could not escape yet. Innocent as he actually was, his position was that of a murderer. He must wait until the coast was clear, and then steal out to hurry away unobserved. He crept up cautiously to the short tunnel and peered out through the opening across the bay. And then his heart sank. Below him, on the sunny beach, a small party of visitors had established themselves just within view of the mouth of the cave, and even as he looked, a man approached from the wooden stairway down the cliff, carrying a couple of deck chairs. So for the present his escape was hopelessly cut off. He went back to the platform and sat down to wait for his release, and as he sat, his thoughts went back once more to the thing that lay under the weed. How long would it lie there undiscovered? And what would happen when it was found? What was there to connect him with it? Of course, there was his name on the clothing, but there was nothing incriminating in that, if he had only the courage to give information at once. But it was too late to think of that now. Besides, it suddenly flashed upon him there was the receipt in the wallet. That receipt mentioned him by name and referred to a loan. Obviously, its suggestion was most sinister, coupled with his silence. It was a deadly item of evidence against him. But no sooner had he realized the appalling significance of this document than he also realized that it was still within his reach. Why should he leave it there to be brought in evidence, in false evidence too, against him? Slowly he rose, and creeping down the tunnel once more looked out. The people were sitting quietly in their chairs, The man was reading and the child was digging in the sand. Elton looked across the bay to make sure that no other person was approaching, and then hastily climbing down the steps, walked across the great bed of weed, driving an army of sandhoppers before him. He shuddered at the thought of what he was going to do, and the clammy chill of the cave seemed to settle on him in a cold sweat. He came to the little mound from which the boot projected, and began, shudderingly and with faltering hand, to lift the slimy, tangled weed. As he drew aside the first bunch, he gave a gasp of horror and quickly replaced it. The body was lying on its back, and as he lifted the weed, he had uncovered, not the face, for the thing had no face. It had struck either the cliff or a stone upon the beach, but there is no need to go into particulars. It had no face. When he had recovered a little, Elton groped shudderingly among the weed until he found the breast pocket, from which he quickly drew out the wallet, now clammy, sodden, and loathsome. He was rising with it in his hand when an apparition, seen through the opening of the cave, arrested his movement as if he had been suddenly turned into stone. A man, apparently a fisherman or sailor, was sauntering past some 30 yards from the mouth of the cave, and at his heels trotted a mongrel dog. The dog stopped, and lifting his nose, seemed to sniff the air, and then he began to walk slowly and suspiciously toward the cave. The man sauntered on and soon passed out of view, but the dog still came on towards the cave, stopping now and again with upraised nose. The catastrophe seemed inevitable. But just at that moment the man's voice rose, loud and angry, evidently calling the dog. The animal hesitated, looking wistfully from his master to the cave, but when the summons was repeated, he turned reluctantly and trotted away. Elton stood up and took a deep breath. The chilly sweat was running down his face. His heart was thumping and his knees trembled, so that he could hardly get back to the platform. What hideous peril had he escaped, and how narrowly? For there he had stood, and had the man entered he would have been caught in the very act of stealing the incriminating document from the body. For that matter, he was little better off now, with the dead man's property on his person, and he resolved instantly to take out and destroy the receipt and put back the wallet. But this was easier thought of than done. The receipt was soaked with seawater, and refused utterly to light when he applied a match to it. In the end, he tore it up into little fragments and deliberately swallowed them one by one. But to restore the wallet was more than he was equal to just now. He would wait until the people had gone home to lunch, and then he would thrust it under the weed as he ran past. So he sat down again, and once more took up the endless thread of his thoughts. The receipt was gone now, and with it the immediate suggestion of motive. There remained only the clothes with their 2 legible markings. They certainly connected him with the body, but they offered no proof of his presence at the catastrophe. And then suddenly another most startling idea occurred to him. Who could identify the body that had no face? There was the wallet, it was true, but he could take that away with him, and there was a ring on the finger and some articles in the pockets which might be identified. But, a voice seemed to whisper to him, these things were removable too, and if he removed them, what then? Why, then the body was that of Thomas Elton, a friendless, poverty-stricken artist, about whom no one would trouble to ask any questions. He pondered on this new situation profoundly. It offered him a choice of alternatives. Either he might choose the imminent risk of being hanged for a murder that he had not committed, or he might surrender his identity forever and move away to a new environment. He smiled faintly. His identity! What might that be worth to barter against his life? Only yesterday he would gladly have surrendered it as the bare price of emancipation from the vampire who had fastened on to him. He thrust the wallet into his pocket and buttoned his coat. Thomas Elton was dead, and that other man, as yet unnamed, should go forth, as the woman had said, into the sunshine. Part 2. Related by Christopher Jervis, M.D. From various causes, the insurance business that passed through Thorndyke's hands had, of late, considerably increased. The number of societies which regularly employed him had grown larger, and since the remarkable case of Percival Bland, the Griffin, had made it a routine practice to send all inquest cases to us for report. Compiler's note: the Percival Bland case actually follows directly after this one in the book. Clearly the order of stories has been transposed. It was in reference to one of these latter that Mr. Stalker, a senior member of the staff of that office, called on us one afternoon in December, and when he had laid his bag on the table and settled himself comfortably before the fire, he opened the business without preamble. "I've brought you another inquest case," said he. "A rather queer one, quite interesting from your point of view. As far as we can see, it has no particular interest for us, excepting that it does rather look as if our examining medical officer had been a little casual." "What is the special interest of the case from our point of view?" asked Thorndyke. "I'll just give you a sketch of it," said Stalker, "and I think you will agree that it's a case after your own heart. On the 24th of last month, some men who were collecting seaweed to use as manure discovered in a cave at Kingsgate, in the Isle of Thanet, the body of a man, lying under a mass of accumulated weed. As the tide was rising, they put the body into their cart and conveyed it to Margate, where of course an inquest was held, and the following facts were elicited. The body was that of a man named Thomas Elton. It was identified by the name marks on the clothing, by the visiting cards and a couple of letters which were found in the pockets. From the address on the letters, it was seen that Elton had been staying in Margate, and on inquiry at that address, it was learned from the old woman who let the lodgings that he had been missing about 4 days. The landlady was taken to the mortuary and at once identified the body as that of her lodger. It remained only to decide how the body came into the cave, and this did not seem to present much difficulty, for the neck had been broken by a tremendous blow, which had practically destroyed the face, and there were distinct evidences of a breaking away of a portion of the top of the cliff, only a few yards from the position of the cave. There was apparently no doubt that Elton had fallen sheer from the top of the overhanging cliff onto the beach. Now one would suppose, with the evidence of this fall of about 150 feet, the smashed face and broken neck, there was not much room for doubt as to the cause of death. I think you will agree with me, Dr. Jervis?" "Certainly," I replied. "It must be admitted that a broken neck is a condition that tends to shorten life." "Quite so," agreed Stalker. "But our friend, the local coroner, is a gentleman who takes nothing for granted, a very Thomas Didymus, who apparently agrees with Dr. Thorndyke that if there is no post-mortem, there is no inquest. So he ordered a post-mortem, which would have appeared to me an absurdly unnecessary proceeding, and I think that even you will agree with me, Dr. Thorndyke." But Thorndyke shook his head. "Not at all," said he. "It might, for instance, be much more easy to push a drugged or poisoned man over a cliff than to put over that same man in his normal state. The appearance of violent accident is an excellent mask for the less obvious forms of murder." "That's perfectly true," said Stalker, "and I suppose that is what the coroner thought. At any rate, he had the post-mortem made, and the result was most curious, for it was found, on opening the body, that the deceased had suffered from a small thoracic aneurism which had burst. Now, as the aneurism must obviously have burst during life, it leaves the cause of death, so I understand, uncertain. At any rate, the medical witness was unable to say whether the deceased fell over the cliff in consequence of the bursting of the aneurism, or burst the aneurism in consequence of falling over the cliff. Of course, it doesn't matter to us which way the thing happened. The only question which interests us is whether a comparatively recently insured man ought to have had an aneurism at all." "Have you paid the claim?" asked Thorndyke. "No, certainly not. We never pay a claim until we have had your report. But as a matter of fact, there is another circumstance that is causing delay. It seems that Elton had mortgaged his policy to a moneylender named Gordon, and it is by him that the claim has been made, or rather, by a clerk of his named Hyams. Now we have had a good many dealings with this man Gordon, and hitherto he has always acted in person, and as he is a somewhat slippery gentleman, we have thought it desirable to have the claim actually signed by him. And that is the difficulty, for it seems that Mr. Gordon is abroad, and his whereabouts unknown to Hyams. So as we certainly can take Hyams' receipt for payment, the matter is in abeyance until Hyams can communicate with his principal. And now I must be running away. I have brought you, as you will see, all the papers, including the policy and the mortgage deed." As soon as he was gone, Thorndyke gathered up the bundle of papers and sorted them out in what he apparently considered the order of their importance. First he glanced quickly through the proposal form, and then took up the copy of the coroner's depositions. "The medical evidence," he remarked, "is very full and complete. Both the coroner and the doctor seem to know their business." "Seeing that the man apparently fell over a cliff," said I, "the medical evidence would not seem to be of first importance. It would seem to be more to the point to ascertain how he came to fall over." "That's quite true," replied Thorndyke, "and yet this report contains some rather curious matter. The deceased had an aneurysm of the arch. That was probably rather recent, but he also had some slight, old-standing aortic disease with full compensatory hypertrophy. He also has a nearly complete set of false teeth. Now, doesn't it strike you, Jervis, as rather odd that a man who was passed only 5 years ago as a first-class life should, in that short interval, have become actually uninsurable?" "Yes, it certainly does look," said I, "as if the fellow had had rather bad luck. What does the proposal form say?" I took the document up and ran my eyes over it. On Thorndyke's advice, medical examiners for the Griffin were instructed to make a somewhat fuller report than is usual in some companies. In this case, the ordinary answers to questions set forth that the heart was perfectly healthy and the teeth rather exceptionally good, and then, in the summary at the end, the examiner remarked, "The proposer seems to be a completely sound and healthy man. He presents no physical defects whatever, with the exception of a bony ankylosis of the first joint of the third finger of the left hand, which he states to have been due to an injury." Thorndyke looked up quickly. "Which finger did you say?" he asked. "The third finger of the left hand," I replied. Thorndyke looked thoughtfully at the paper that he was reading. "It's very singular," said he, "for I see that the Margate doctor states that the deceased wore a signet ring on the third finger of the left hand. Now, of course, you couldn't get a ring onto a finger with bony ankylosis of the joint." "He must have mistaken the finger," said I, "or else the insurance examiner did." "That is quite possible," Thorndyke replied, "but doesn't it strike you as very singular that, whereas the insurance examiner mentions the ankylosis, which was of no importance from an insurance point of view, the very careful man who made the post-mortem should not have mentioned it, though, owing to the unrecognizable condition of the face, it was of vital importance for the purpose of identification?" I admitted that it was very singular indeed, and we then resumed our study of the respective papers. But presently I noticed that Thorndyke had laid the report upon his knee and was gazing speculatively into the fire. "I gather," said I, "that my learned friend finds some matter of interest in this case." For reply he handed me the bundle of papers, recommending me to look through them. "Thank you," said I, rejecting them firmly, "but I think I can trust you to have picked out all the plums." Thorndyke smiled indulgently. "They're not plums, Jervis," said he, "they're only currants, but they make quite a substantial little heap." I disposed myself in a receptive attitude, somewhat after the fashion of the juvenile pelican, and he continued, "If we take the small and unimpressive items and add them together, you will see that quite a considerable sum of discrepancy results. Thus: in 1903, Thomas Elton, aged 31, had a sound set of teeth. In 1908, at the age of 36, he was more than half toothless. Again, at the age of 31, his heart was perfectly healthy. At the age of 36, he had an old aortic disease with fully established compensation and an aneurysm that was probably due to it. When he was examined, he had a noticeable incurable malformation. No such malformation is mentioned in connection with the body. He appears to have fallen over a cliff, and he had also burst an aneurysm. Now, the bursting of the aneurysm must obviously have occurred during life, but it would occasion practically instantaneous death. Therefore, if the fall was accidental, the rupture must have occurred either as he stood at the edge of the cliff, as he was in the act of falling, or on striking the beach. At the place where he apparently fell, the footpath is some 30 yards distant from the edge of the cliff. It is not known how he came to that spot, or whether he was alone at the time. Someone is claiming £500 as the immediate result of his death. There, you see, Jervis, are 7 propositions, none of them extremely striking, but rather suggestive when taken together. You seem, said I, to suggest a doubt as to the identity of the body. I do, he replied. The identity was not clearly established. You don't think the clothing and the visiting cards conclusive? They're not parts of the body, he replied. Of course, substitution is highly improbable, but it is not impossible. And the old woman, I suggested, but he interrupted me. My dear Jervis, he exclaimed, I'm surprised at you. How many times has it happened, within our knowledge, that women have identified the bodies of total strangers as those of their husbands, fathers, or brothers? The thing happens almost every year. As to this old woman, she saw a body with an unrecognizable face, dressed in the clothes of her missing lodger. Of course, it was the clothes that she identified. I suppose it was, I agreed, and then I said, you seem to suggest the possibility of foul play. Well, he replied, if you consider those 7 points, you will agree with me that they present a cumulative discrepancy which it is impossible to ignore. The whole significance of the case turns on the question of identity, for, if this was not the body of Thomas Elton, it would appear to have been deliberately prepared to counterfeit that body, and such deliberate preparation would manifestly imply an attempt to conceal the identity of some other body. Then, he continued after a pause, there is this deed. It looks quite regular, and is correctly stamped, but it seems to me that the surface of the paper is slightly altered in 1 or 2 places, and if one holds the document up to the light, the paper looks a little more transparent in those places. He examined the documents for a few seconds with his pocket lens, and then passing lens and document to me, he said, have a look at it, Jervis, and tell me what you think. I scrutinized the paper closely, taking it over to the window to get a better light, and to me also the paper appeared to be changed in certain places. Are we agreed as to the position of the altered places? Thorndyke asked when I announced the fact. I only see 3 patches, I answered, 2 corresponding to the name Thomas Elton, and the third to one of the figures in the policy number. Exactly, said Thorndyke. And the significance is obvious. If the paper has really been altered, it means that some other name has been erased and Elton substituted, by which arrangement, of course, the correctly dated stamp would be secured. And this, the alteration of an old document, is the only form of forgery that is possible with a dated impressed stamp. Wouldn't it be rather a stroke of luck, I asked, for a forger to happen to have in his possession a document needing only these 2 alterations? I see nothing remarkable in it, Thorndyke replied. A money-lender would have a number of documents of this kind in hand, and you observe that he was not bound down to any particular date. Any date within a year or so of the issue of the policy would answer his purpose. This document is, in fact, dated, as you will see, about 6 months after the issue of the policy. I suppose, said I, that you will draw Stalker's attention to this matter. He will have to be informed, of course, Thorndyke replied, but I think it would be interesting in the first place to call on Mr. Hyams. You will have noticed that there are some rather mysterious features in this case, and Mr. Hyams' conduct, especially if this document should turn out to be really a forgery, suggests that he may have some special information on the subject. He glanced at his watch, and after a few moments' reflection added, I don't see why we shouldn't make our little ceremonial call at once. But it will be a delicate business, for we have mighty little to go upon. Are you coming with me? If I had any doubts, Thorndyke's last remark disposed of them, for the interview promised to be quite a sporting event. Mr. Hyams was presumably not quite newly hatched, and Thorndyke, who utterly despised bluff of any kind, and whose exact mind refused either to act or speak one hair's breadth beyond his knowledge, was admittedly in somewhat of a fog. The meeting promised to be really entertaining. Mr. Hyams was discovered, as the playwrights have it, in a small office at the top of a high building in Queen Victoria Street. He was a small gentleman of sallow and greasy aspect, with heavy eyebrows and a still heavier nose. "Are you Mr. Gordon?" Thorndyke suavely inquired as we entered. Mr. Hyams seemed to experience a momentary doubt on the subject, but finally decided that he was not. "But perhaps," he added brightly, "I can do your business for you as well." "I dare say you can," Thorndyke agreed significantly, on which we were conducted into an inner den, where I noticed Thorndyke's eye rest for an instant on a large iron safe. "Now," said Mr. Hyams, shutting the door ostentatiously, "what can I do for you?" "I want you," Thorndyke replied, "to answer one or two questions with reference to the claim made by you on the Griffin office in respect of Thomas Elton." Mr. Hyams' manner underwent a sudden change. He began rapidly to turn over papers and opened and shut the drawers of his desk with an air of restless preoccupation. "Did the Griffin people send you here?" he demanded brusquely. "They did not specially instruct me to call on you," replied Thorndyke. "Then," said Hyams, bouncing out of his chair, "I can't let you occupy my time. I'm not here to answer conundrums from Tom, Dick, or Harry." Thorndyke rose from his chair. "Then I am to understand," he said with unruffled suavity, "that you would prefer me to communicate with the directors and leave them to take any necessary action." This gave Mr. Hyams pause. "What action do you refer to?" he asked, "and who are you?" Thorndyke produced a card and laid it on the table. Mr. Hyams had apparently seen the name before, for he suddenly grew rather pale and very serious. "What is the nature of the questions you wish to ask?" he inquired. "They refer to this claim," replied Thorndyke. "The first question is, where is Mr. Gordon?" "I don't know," said Hyams. "Where do you think he is?" asked Thorndyke. "I don't think at all," replied Hyams, turning a shade paler and looking everywhere but at Thorndyke. "Very well," said the latter. "Then the next question is, are you satisfied that this claim is really payable?" "I shouldn't have made it if it hadn't been," replied Hyams. "Quite so," said Thorndyke. "And the third question is, are you satisfied that the mortgage deed was executed as it purports to have been?" "I can't say anything about that," replied Hyams, who was growing every moment paler and more fidgety. "It was done before my time." "Thank you," said Thorndyke. "You will of course understand why I am making these inquiries." "I don't," said Hyams. "Then," said Thorndyke, "perhaps I had better explain. We are dealing, you observe, Mr. Hyams, with the case of a man who has met with violent death under somewhat mysterious circumstances. We are dealing also with another man who has disappeared, leaving his affairs to take care of themselves, and with a claim put forward by a third party on behalf of the one man in respect of the other. When I say that the dead man has been imperfectly identified, and that the document supporting the claim presents certain peculiarities, you will see that the matter calls for further inquiry." There was an appreciable interval of silence. Mr. Hyams had turned a tallowy white, and looked furtively about the room, as if anxious to avoid the stony gaze that my colleague had fixed on him. "Can you give us no assistance?" Thorndyke inquired at length. Mr. Hyams chewed a penholder ravenously as he considered the question. At length he burst out in an agitated voice. "Look here, sir, if I tell you what I know, will you treat the information as confidential?" "I can't agree to that, Mr. Hyams," replied Thorndyke. "It might amount to compounding a felony. But you will be wiser to tell me what you know. The document is a side issue, which my clients may never raise, and my own concern is with the death of this man." Hyams looked distinctly relieved. "If that's so," said he, "I'll tell you all I know, which is precious little, and which just amounts to this. 2 days after Elton was killed, someone came to this office in my absence and opened the safe. I discovered the fact the next morning. Someone had been to the safe and rummaged over all the papers. It wasn't Gordon, because he knew where to find everything, and it wasn't an ordinary thief, because no cash or valuables had been taken. In fact, The only thing that I missed was a promissory note drawn by Elton." "You didn't miss a mortgage deed?" suggested Thorndyke, and Hyams, having snatched a little further refreshment from the penholder, said he did not. "And the policy," suggested Thorndyke, "was apparently not taken?" "No," replied Hyams, "but it was looked for. 3 bundles of policies had been untied, but this one happened to be in a drawer of my desk, and I had the only key." "And what do you infer from this visit?" Thorndyke asked. "Well," replied Hyams, "the safe was opened with keys, and they were Gordon's keys, or at any rate they weren't mine, and the person who opened it wasn't Gordon, and the things that were taken, at least the thing, I mean, chiefly, concerned Elton. Naturally I smelt a rat, and when I read of finding of the body I smelt a fox." "And have you formed any opinion about the body that was found?" "Yes, I have," he replied. "My opinion is that it was Gordon's body, that Gordon had been putting the screw on Elton, and Elton had just pitched him over the cliff and gone down and changed clothes with the body. Of course, that's only my opinion. I may be wrong, but I don't think I am." As a matter of fact, Mr. Hyams was not wrong. An exhumation, consequent on Thorndyke's challenge of the identity of the deceased, showed that the body was that of Solomon Gordon. £100 reward was offered for information as to Elton's whereabouts, but no one ever earned it. A letter, bearing the postmark of Marseilles, and addressed by the missing man to Thorndyke, gave a plausible account of Gordon's death, which was represented as having occurred accidentally at the moment when Gordon chanced to be wearing a suit of Elton's clothes. Of course, this account may have been correct, or again, it may have been false, but whether it was true or false, Elton from that moment vanished from our ken and has never since been heard of. End of The Missing Mortgagee by R. Austin Freeman. Read by Alan Winterroud. Audio.boomcoach.com.
Chapter 9 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 9, containing further particulars concerning the pleasant old gentleman and his hopeful pupils. It was late next morning when Oliver awoke from a sound, long sleep. There was no other person in the room but the old Jew, who was boiling some coffee in a saucepan for breakfast, and whistling softly to himself as he stirred it round and round with an iron spoon. He would stop every now and then to listen when there was the least noise below, and when he had satisfied himself, he would go on whistling and stirring again as before. Although Oliver had roused himself from sleep, he was not thoroughly awake. There is a drowsy state, between sleeping and waking, when you dream more in 5 minutes with your eyes half open, and yourself half conscious of everything that is passing around you, than you would in 5 nights with your eyes fast closed, and your senses wrapped in perfect unconsciousness. At such time, a mortal knows just enough of what his mind is doing to form some glimmering conception of its mighty powers, its bounding from earth and spurning time and space when freed from the restraint of its corporeal associate. Oliver was precisely in this condition. He saw the Jew with his half-closed eyes, heard his low whistling, and recognized the sound of the spoon grating against the saucepan's sides, and yet the self-same senses were mentally engaged at the same time in busy action with almost everybody he had ever known. When the coffee was done, the Jew drew the saucepan to the hob, standing then in an irresolute attitude for a few minutes, as if he did not know how to employ himself. He turned around and looked at Oliver, and called him by his name. He did not answer, and was to all appearances asleep. After satisfying himself upon this head, the Jew stepped gently to the door, which he fastened. He then drew forth, as it seemed to Oliver, from some trap in the floor, a small box, which he placed carefully on the table. His eyes glistened as he raised the lid and looked in. Dragging an old chair to the table, he sat down and took from it a magnificent gold watch, sparkling with jewels. "Aha!" said the Jew, shrugging up his shoulders, and distorting every feature with a hideous grin. "Clever dogs! Clever dogs! Staunch to the last! Never told the old parson where they were! Never poached upon old Fagin! And why should they? It wouldn't have loosened the knot, or kept the drop up a minute longer. No, no, no! Fine fellows! Fine fellows!" With these and other muttered reflections of the like nature, the Jew once more deposited the watch in its place of safety. At least half a dozen more were severally drawn forth from the same box, and surveyed with equal pleasure, besides rings, brooches, bracelets, and other articles of jewellery of such magnificent materials and costly workmanship that Oliver had no idea even of their names. Having replaced these trinkets, the Jew took out another, so small that it lay in the palm of his hand. There seemed to be some very minute inscription on it, for the Jew laid it flat upon the table, and shading it with his hand, pored over it long and earnestly. At length he put it down, as if despairing of success, and leaning back in his chair, muttered, "What a fine thing capital punishment is! Dead men never repent. Dead men never bring awkward stories to light. Ah, it's a fine thing for the trade. 5 of 'em, strung up in a row, and none left to play booty or turn white-livered." As the Jew uttered these words, his bright, dark eyes, which had been staring vacantly before him, fell on Oliver's face. The boy's eyes were fixed on his in mute curiosity, and although the recognition was only for an instant, for the briefest space of time that can possibly be conceived, it was enough to show the old man that he had been observed. He closed the lid of the box with a loud crash, and laying his hand on a bread knife which was on the table, started furiously up. He trembled very much, though, for even in his terror Oliver could see that the knife quivered in the air. "What's that?" said the Jew. "What do you watch me for? Why are you awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy! Quick! Quick for your life!"
"I wasn't able to sleep any longer, sir," replied Oliver meekly. "I'm very sorry if I have disturbed you, sir."
"You were not awake an hour ago," said the Jew, scowling furiously on the boy.
"No, no, indeed," replied Oliver.
"Are you sure?" cried the Jew, with a still fiercer look than before, and a threatening attitude.
"Upon my word, I was not, sir," replied Oliver earnestly. "I was not, indeed, sir."
"Tush, tush, my dear," said the Jew, abruptly resuming his old manner, and playing with the knife a little before he laid it down, as if to induce the belief that he had caught it up in mere sport. "Of course I know that, my dear. I only tried to frighten you. You're a brave boy. Ha ha! You're a brave boy, Oliver." The Jew rubbed his hands with a chuckle, but glanced uneasily at the box, notwithstanding. "Did you see any of these pretty things, my dear?" said the Jew, laying his hand upon it after a short pause.
"Yes, sir,"
replied Oliver. "Ah!" said the Jew, turning rather pale. They're mine, Oliver. My little property. All I have to live on in my old age. The folks call me a miser, my dear. Only a miser, that's all.
Oliver thought the old gentleman must be a decided miser to live in such a dirty place, with so many watches, but thinking that perhaps his fondness for the Dodger and the other boys cost him a good deal of money, he cast only a deferential look at the Jew, and asked if he might get up.
Certainly, my dear, certainly,
replied the old gentleman.
Stay, there's a pitcher of water in the corner by the door. Bring it here, and I'll give you a basin to wash in, my dear.
Oliver got up, walked across the room, and stooped for an instant to raise the pitcher. When he turned his head, the box was gone. He had scarcely washed himself and made everything tidy by emptying the basin out of the window agreeably to the Jew's directions, when the Dodger returned, accompanied by a very sprightly young friend whom Oliver had seen smoking on the previous night, and who was now formally introduced to him as Charlie Bates. The four sat down to breakfast on the coffee and some hot rolls and ham which the Dodger had brought home in the crown of his hat.
Well,
said the Jew, glancing slyly at Oliver, and addressing himself to the Dodger,
I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears.
hard, replied the Dodger.
As nails,
added Charlie Bates.
good boys, said the Jew. What have you got, Dodger?
A couple of pocketbooks,
replied that young gentleman.
Lined?
inquired the Jew with eagerness.
pretty well.
replied the Dodger, producing two pocketbooks, one green and the other red.
Not so heavy as they might be,
said the Jew, after looking at the insides carefully,
but very neat and nicely made. Ingenious workman, ain't he, Oliver?
Very indeed, sir,
said Oliver, at which Mr. Charles Bates laughed uproariously, very much to the amazement of Oliver, who saw nothing to laugh at in anything that had passed.
And what have you got, my dear?
said Fagin to Charlie Bates.
Wipes,
replied Master Bates, at the same time producing 4 pocket handkerchiefs.
Well,
said the Jew, inspecting them closely,
they're good ones, very. You haven't marked them well, though, Charlie, so the marks shall be picked out with a needle, and we'll teach Oliver how to do it. Shall us, Oliver, eh?
if you please, sir,
said Oliver.
You'd like to be able to make pocket handkerchiefs as easy as Charlie Bates, wouldn't you, my dear?
said the Jew.
very much indeed, if you'll teach me, sir,
replied Oliver. Master Bates saw something so exquisitely ludicrous in this reply that he burst into another laugh, which laugh, meeting the coffee he was drinking and carrying it down some wrong channel, very nearly terminated in his premature suffocation.
"He is so jolly green,"
said Charlie, when he recovered, as an apology to the company for his unpolite behavior. The Dodger said nothing, but he smoothed Oliver's hair over his eyes, and said he'd know better by and by, upon which the old gentleman, observing Oliver's colour mounting, changed the subject by asking whether there had been much of a crowd at the execution that morning. This made him wonder more and more, for it was plain from the replies of the two boys that they had both been there, and Oliver naturally wondered how they could possibly have found time to be so very industrious. When the breakfast was cleared away, the merry old gentleman and the two boys played at a very curious and uncommon game, which was performed in this way. The merry old gentleman, placing a snuff-box in one pocket of his trousers, and a note-case in the other, and a watch in his waistcoat pocket with a guard chain around his neck, and sticking a mock diamond pin in his shirt, buttoned his coat tight round him, and putting his spectacle case and his handkerchief in his pockets, trotted up and down the room with a stick
in imitation of the manner in which old gentlemen walk about the streets any hour in the day. Sometimes he stopped at the fireplace, and sometimes at the door, making believe that he was staring with all his might into shop windows. At such times he would look constantly around him for fear of thieves, and would keep slapping all his pockets in turn to see that he hadn't lost anything, in such a very funny and natural manner that Oliver laughed till the tears ran down his face. All this time the two boys followed him closely about, getting out of his sight so nimbly every time he turned around that it was impossible to follow their motions. At last the Dodger trod upon his toes or ran upon his boot accidentally, while Charley Bates stumbled up against him behind, and in that moment they took from him, with the most extraordinary rapidity, snuff-box, note-case, watch-guard, chain, shirt-pin, pocket-handkerchief, even the spectacle-case. If the old gentleman felt a hand in any of his pockets, he cried out where it was, and then the game began, all over again. When this game had been played a great many times, a couple of young ladies called to see the young gentleman, one of whom was named Bet, and the other Nancy. They wore a great deal of hair, not very neatly turned up behind, and were rather untidy about the shoes and stockings. They were not exactly pretty, perhaps, but they had a great deal of color in their faces, and looked quite stout and hearty. Being remarkably free and agreeable in their manners, Oliver thought them very nice girls indeed, and there is no doubt they were. The visitors stopped a long time. Spirits were produced, in consequence of one of the young ladies complaining of a coldness in her inside, and the conversation took a very convivial and improving turn. At length Charley Bates expressed his opinion that it was time to pad the hoof. This, it occurred to Oliver, must be French for going out, for directly afterwards the Dodger and Charley and the two young ladies went away together, having been kindly furnished by the amiable old Jew with money to spend.
"There, my dear," said Fagin, "that's a pleasant life, isn't it? They have gone out for the day."
"Have they done work, sir?" inquired Oliver.
"Yes," said the Jew. "That is, unless they should unexpectedly come across any when they are out, and they won't neglect it if they do, my dear, depend upon it."
"Make 'em your models, my dear. Make 'em your models,"
tapping the fire shovel on the hearth to add force to his words.
"Do everything they bid you. Take their advice in all matters, especially the Dodger's, my dear. He'll be a great man himself, and will make you one too, if you take pattern by him."
"Is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?"
said the Jew, stopping short.
"Yes, sir," said Oliver.
"See if you can take it out without my feeling it, as you saw them do when we were at play this morning."
Oliver held up the bottom of the pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger hold it, and drew the handkerchief lightly out with the other.
"Is it gone?"
cried the Jew.
"Here it is, sir,"
said Oliver, showing it in his hand.
"You're a clever boy, my dear,"
said the playful old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head approvingly.
"I never saw such a sharper lad. Here's a shilling for you. If you go on in this way, you'll be the greatest man of all time. Now come here, and I'll show you how to take the marks out of the handkerchiefs."
Oliver wondered what picking the old gentleman's pocket in play had to do with his chances of being a great man, but, thinking that the Jew, being so much his senior, must know best, he followed him quietly to the table, and was soon deeply involved in his new study. End of Chapter 9 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Read by Adam.
The Pawn Shop Keeper by Marjorie Verner Reed.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Pawn Shop Keeper by Marjorie Verner Reed. I am an old man, and life has long since lost the glamour it once held for me. The thrills of youth are no more, novelty is a forgotten word, and things that once would have made my heart leap now leave me cold. Old age, indeed, is in itself a punishment for the follies of youth, and sad is it to await alone the coming of death without some loved face near. For one by one the friends of bygone days have dropped by the roadside, and I have been left alone to follow my weary way. Happy they who die while still young, and do not know the solitude of a lonely old man. Day after day, as I sit behind my counter, or warm my old hands by the cheerful blaze of the fire, do customers come to me to buy something, or perhaps to sell some loved relic, in order that they may live. All of them faces strange and new. They look at me as if to say, why this one dried leaf of another year left on this tree? And why am I left? Why among these young green leaves am I the only withered one? Why were no companions left to cheer me? But these are questions I cannot answer, for I know not the ways of God. As I sit here, musing over the past, faces I have known come back to me, and I love to wonder what fate held in store for them, as, advancing, the filmy mists of their futures were slowly lifted until the last veil was drawn back, and the story of their lives was told. The snow is falling, and covering in white the grim rows of houses opposite my little shop. The streets are deserted, save by a few hurrying pedestrians and some merry school children going down to the frozen river for an hour's skating before dusk. And I am here before the fire, dreaming and waiting, for yesterday brought me an experience very different from my usual monotonous life. Was it all some phantom? It must be. The Miriam that I have longed for all these years was not here yesterday, did not sit in this very chair. It must have been a vision, the mere fancy of an old man's mind. For how many times in sleep has not the same dream come to me as a whispered message from another world, from her grave even, and on awakening I always seemed to know that her journey through life was at an end. But no, it was not a phantom, for here is the necklace. Then it was not a dream. Fate has really sent her to me so we can cheer each other in these the last hours of our earthly lives. But will she come back today as she promised? Or will she depart again, this time for good, so that I shall see her no more until I have crossed the river of death? Oh, Miriam, come to me. I need you more now than ever before. Come, I am waiting with outstretched arms. Yes, she is coming. I see the yet distant form of the one I love. She is approaching, coming ever nearer. Miriam, what happiness we shall yet have together in the dusk of our lives! What pleasant hours here by the fire! Death, kindly death, come now to me. She passed by my shop and turned the corner and went toward the station. Her heart, then, is still cold as stone. It was the money I paid her for the necklace that bought her ticket to another town. End of The Pawn Shop Keeper by Marjorie Verner Reed.
A Respectable Woman by Kate Chopin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Respectable Woman by Kate Chopin. Mrs. Baroda was a little provoked to learn that her husband expected his friend Gouvernail up to spend a week or two on the plantation. They had entertained a good deal during the winter; much of the time had also been passed in New Orleans in various forms of mild dissipation. She was looking forward to a period of unbroken rest now, and undisturbed tête à tête with her husband, when he informed her that Gouvernail was coming up to stay a week or two. This was a man she had heard much of, but never seen. He had been her husband's college friend, was now a journalist, and in no sense a society man or a man about town, which were, perhaps, some of the reasons she had never met him. But she had unconsciously formed an image of him in her mind. She pictured him tall, slim, cynical, with eyeglasses, and his hands in his pockets, and she did not like him. Gouvernail was slim enough, but he wasn't very tall nor very cynical. Neither did he wear eyeglasses nor carry his hands in his pockets, and she rather liked him when he first presented himself. But why she liked him she could not explain satisfactorily to herself when she partly attempted to do so. She could discover in him none of those brilliant and promising traits which Gaston, her husband, had often assured her that he possessed. On the contrary, he sat rather mute and receptive before her chatty eagerness to make him feel at home, and in face of Gaston's frank and wordy hospitality. His manner was as courteous toward her as the most exacting woman could require, but he made no direct appeal to her approval or even esteem. Once settled at the plantation, he seemed to like to sit upon the wide portico in the shade of one of the big Corinthian pillars, smoking his cigar lazily and listening attentively to Gaston's experience as a sugar planter. "This is what I call living," he would utter with deep satisfaction, as the air that swept across the sugar field caressed him with its warm and scented, velvety touch. It pleased him also to get on familiar terms with the big dogs that came about him, rubbing themselves sociably against his legs. He did not care to fish, and displayed no eagerness to go out and kill grosbecs when Gaston proposed doing so. Gouvernail's personality puzzled Mrs. Baroda, but she liked him. Indeed, he was a lovable, inoffensive fellow. After a few days, when she could understand him no better than at first, she gave over being puzzled and remained piqued. In this mood, she left her husband and her guest, for the most part, alone together. Then, finding that Gouvernail took no manner of exception to her action, she imposed her society upon him, accompanying him in his idle strolls to the mill and walks along the Bature. She persistently sought to penetrate the reserve in which he had unconsciously enveloped himself. "When is he going, your friend?" she one day asked her husband. "For my part, he tires me frightfully." "Not for a week yet, dear. I can't understand. He gives you no trouble." "No. I should like him better if he did. If he were more like others, and I had to plan somewhat for his comfort and enjoyment." Gaston took his wife's pretty face between his hands and looked tenderly and laughingly into her troubled eyes. They were making a bit of toilet sociably together in Mrs. Baroda's dressing room. "You are full of surprises, ma belle," he said to her. "Even I can never count upon how you are going to act under given conditions." He kissed her and turned to fasten his cravat before the mirror. "Here you are," he went on, "taking poor Gouvernail seriously and making a commotion over him, the last thing he would desire or expect." "Commotion?" she hotly resented. "Nonsense! How can you say such a thing? Commotion, indeed! But you know you said he was clever." "So he is. But the poor fellow is run down by overwork now. That's why I asked him here to take a rest." "You used to say he was a man of ideas," she retorted, unconciliated. "I expected him to be interesting, at least. I'm going to the city in the morning to have my spring gowns fitted. Let me know when Mr. Gouvernail is gone. I shall be at my Aunt Octavie's." That night she went and sat alone upon a bench that stood beneath a live oak tree at the edge of the gravel walk. She had never known her thoughts or her intentions to be so confused. She could gather nothing from them but the feeling of a distinct necessity to quit her home in the morning. Mrs. Baroda heard footsteps crunching the gravel, but could discern in the darkness only the approaching red point of a lighted cigar. She knew it was Gouvernail, for her husband did not smoke. She hoped to remain unnoticed, but her white gown revealed her to him. He threw away his cigar and seated himself upon the bench beside her, without a suspicion that she might object to his presence. "Your husband told me to bring this to you, Mrs. Baroda," he said, handing her a filmy white scarf with which she sometimes enveloped her head and shoulders. She accepted the scarf from him with a murmur of thanks and let it lie in her lap. He made some commonplace observation upon the baneful effect of the night air at the season. Then, as his gaze reached out into the darkness, he murmured, half to himself, "Night of south winds, night of the large few stars, still nodding night." She made no reply to this apostrophe to the night, which indeed was not addressed to her. Gouvernail was in no sense a diffident man, for he was not a self-conscious one. His periods of reserve were not constitutional, but the result of moods. Sitting there beside Mrs. Baroda, his silence melted for the time. He talked freely and intimately in a low, hesitating drawl that was not unpleasant to hear. He talked of the old college days when he and Gaston had been a good deal to each other, of the days of keen and blind ambitions and large intentions. Now there was left with him, at least, a philosophic acquiescence to the existing order, only a desire to be permitted to exist, with now and then a little whiff of genuine life, such as he was breathing now. Her mind only vaguely grasped what he was saying. Her physical being was, for the moment, predominant. She was not thinking of his words, only drinking in the tones of his voice. She wanted to reach out her hand in the darkness and touch him with the sensitive tips of her fingers upon the face or the lips. She wanted to draw close to him and whisper against his cheek, she did not care what, as she might have done if she had not been a respectable woman. The stronger the impulse grew to bring herself near him, the further, in fact, did she draw away from him. As soon as she could do so without an appearance of too great rudeness, she rose and left him there alone. Before she reached the house, Gouvernail had lighted a fresh cigar and ended his apostrophe to the night. Mrs. Baroda was greatly tempted that night to tell her husband, who was also her friend, of this folly that had seized her. But she did not yield to the temptation. Beside being a respectable woman, she was a very sensible one, and she knew there are some battles in life which a human being must fight alone. When Gaston arose in the morning, his wife had already departed. She had taken an early morning train to the city. She did not return till Gouvernail was gone from under her roof. There was some talk of having him back during the summer that followed. That is, Gaston greatly desired it, but this desire yielded to his wife's strenuous opposition. However, before the year ended, she proposed, wholly from herself, to have Gouvernail visit them again. Her husband was surprised and delighted with the suggestion coming from her. "I am glad, chère amie, to know that you have finally overcome your dislike for him. Truly, he did not deserve it." "Oh," she told him laughingly, after pressing a long, tender kiss upon his lips, "I have overcome everything. You will see. This time I shall be very nice to him." End of A Respectable Woman by Kate Chopin. Read by Lois Hill.